My name is Natalie. I am 33 years old, and at my lavish $100,000 wedding reception, my grandfather trembled as he pressed a frayed old bank passbook into my hands and whispered that it was my way out. Before I could even process his words, my father snatched the book away and threw it straight into a silver champagne ice bucket, declaring that trash belongs with trash. When I turned to my groom for support, he hissed at me to apologize to my father because he did not want to lose our condo down payment. I looked at the man I was supposed to marry, pulled off my diamond ring, threw it at his chest, and walked out into the freezing night. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from toxic people who thought their money could buy your submission. Growing up in Chicago, my father, Harrison, measured a person's worth strictly by their bank account and their obedience. He is a ruthless real estate developer who views everything, including his daughters, as business transactions. I never fit into his world. Instead of joining his corporate empire, like my younger sister Chelsea, who happily played the role of the entitled golden child, living on his credit cards, I built my own boutique floral and event design studio. I worked long, exhausting days to establish my independence. But no matter how successful my business became to my father, I was just playing with flowers. My wedding day was supposed to be a celebration of love, but my father turned it into a networking event for his real estate firm. He paid a massive sum for the reception at a five-star downtown hotel, a fact he loudly reminded everyone of throughout the evening. I hated the extravagant display, but my fiancé Bradley insisted we accept his generosity. Bradley worked in middle management and constantly talked about wanting the finer things in life. I thought he was just ambitious. I did not realize he was auditioning for a spot on my father's payroll. The ballroom was overflowing with investors and politicians my father wanted to impress. I stood near the head table, feeling completely suffocated in my heavy silk dress, scanning the crowd for a friendly face. That was when Grandpa Silas approached me. At 85 years old, he was the only person in the family who truly loved me without conditions. He had suffered a mild stroke a year prior and moved slowly, relying on a cane, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He pulled me away from the loud music and the flashing cameras, steering me toward a quiet alcove near the catering doors. His hands were shaking as he reached inside his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a small frayed navy blue bank passbook. The edges were worn, and it looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a luxury hotel ballroom. "Keep this, sweetheart," Grandpa Silas whispered, pressing the rough cardboard into my palms. His grip was surprisingly strong. "This is your way out. Do not let him control you anymore." I stared down at the old passbook, completely confused. "Grandpa, what is this?" I asked, tracing my fingers over the faded gold lettering on the cover. Before he could explain, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. It was my father. Harrison glared at the passbook in my hands, his face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. He did not ask what it was, he simply snatched it right out of my grasp. "What is this garbage?" my father barked, holding the book up by the corner, as if it were contaminated. He turned his glare onto Grandpa Silas. "You are losing your mind, old man. I am hosting the social event of the season, impressing foreign investors, and you are handing my daughter a piece of literal garbage." "Dad, stop it," I pleaded, trying to reach for the passbook. "Give it back to him." My father let out a harsh, barking laugh. He looked around the alcove, spotted a silver champagne ice bucket resting on a nearby table, and without a second thought tossed the passbook straight into the melting ice and freezing water. "Trash belongs with trash," my father declared loudly, not caring who heard him. "I paid 6 figures for this wedding, Natalie. I will not have you standing around holding some senile old man's junk. Put that garbage away and go smile for the cameras with your husband." I gasped, watching the dark blue dye of the passbook cover begin to bleed into the icy water. I shoved past my father and plunged my bare hands into the freezing water, frantically fishing the soaking wet book out of the ice. The pages were soaked, the ink blurring, and the cold bit into my skin. I held it against my chest, ruining the front of my expensive silk wedding gown. I turned around, shaking with rage, and saw Bradley rushing over. My groom, my partner, the man who had promised to protect me. I looked at him, tears of anger stinging my eyes, waiting for him to defend me and my grandfather against my father's cruelty. Instead, Bradley looked at my wet dress and scowled deeply, his face contorted with annoyance entirely devoid of sympathy. "Stop being so dramatic," Natalie Bradley hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from Grandpa Silas. "Look at your dress. You are making a scene in front of the investors. Apologize to your father right now." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he had just said. "Apologize?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He just threw my grandfather's gift into a bucket of water and insulted him. Bradley tightened his grip on my arm. "I do not care about some old book, Natalie. I am not losing the down payment he promised for our condo just because you want to throw a tantrum over some trash. Just say you are sorry, and let us get back to the party." The words hit me harder than physical blows. The condo down payment, the networking, the constant agreement with every toxic thing my father said. In a single shattering moment, the blinders fell from my eyes. Bradley did not love me. He loved my proximity to Harrison's wealth. He was nothing but a coward and a gold digger bought and paid for by the very man who had tormented me my entire life. I looked down at the wet passbook in my hand, then up at Bradley's irritated face. The realization brought a strange, icy calm over me. I pulled my arm out of his grasp with violent force. I looked down at my left hand, grabbed the large diamond engagement ring Bradley had bought using a loan my father guaranteed, and pulled it off my finger. "I am not apologizing," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the background music. "And I am not marrying a spineless coward who lets my family treat me like garbage." I threw the heavy diamond ring directly at Bradley's chest. It hit his tuxedo lapel and bounced onto the marble floor with a sharp clatter. Bradley's jaw dropped in absolute shock. My father stepped forward, his face turning an angry shade of purple, shouting my name. I ignored them both. I turned on my heel, grabbed the heavy, soaked silk train of my wedding dress, and tore a massive rip right up the seam so I could walk faster. I stormed out of the ballroom, pushing past the shocked guests and the lavish floral arrangements I had designed myself. I walked out into the freezing Chicago night air, my dress ruined, my engagement shattered, but my hands tightly gripping the wet passbook. I had no idea what was inside it, but I knew I was never going back. The freezing wind hit me the second the heavy glass doors of the hotel closed behind me. My ripped silk dress offered absolutely zero protection against the brutal, biting Chicago winter. I stood on the curb, my breath pluming in the icy air, and pulled my phone from the hidden pocket of my gown. My fingers were completely numb, shaking violently as I opened the rideshare app. I requested a car to take me back to the apartment I shared with Bradley. I watched the screen loading, desperately waiting for a driver to accept the ride so I could escape the freezing temperature. Instead, a harsh red error message flashed across the screen. "Payment method declined. Please update your billing information." I frowned, my teeth chattering uncontrollably as the wind whipped my hair across my face. I deleted the primary card and selected my backup credit card. Declined again. I tried my debit card next. Insufficient funds. Panic flared tightly in my chest. I opened my banking app, praying it was just a glitch with the network or the cold weather affecting my phone. The screen loaded slowly, ultimately revealing a balance of exactly $0 across every single account I possessed. A text notification dropped down from the top of my screen. It was from Bradley. I tapped it open, expecting an apology or a plea for me to come back inside and talk things out. Instead, the message read, "Your dad canceled your supplementary cards. I changed the locks on our apartment. Do not bother coming back." I stared at the harsh, glowing letters until my vision blurred. My father had executed his favorite and most devastating maneuver. He had severed the financial cord. For my entire life, my father maintained his iron grip on my independence by making sure every significant financial asset I had was tied to his corporate accounts. Even the lease on the apartment I shared with Bradley was under his real estate company's umbrella. He let me run my floral business to keep me busy, but he kept my personal finances tethered firmly to his firm. If I ever disobeyed him, he simply pulled the plug. He expected me to freeze on the sidewalk, realize I had absolutely nothing, and crawl back inside the ballroom to apologize in front of all his investors. Bradley had happily assisted him securing his own financial position while locking me out of my own home on our wedding night. I refused to crawl back. I gripped the wet passbook tightly against my chest, turned my back on the brightly lit luxury hotel, and walked toward the nearest subway station. Descending into the underground terminal, the harsh fluorescent lights illuminated exactly how pathetic I looked. My expensive designer gown was torn at the seams and heavily stained with muddy slush from the city streets. My hair was falling out of its elaborate bridal updo, plastered to my cheeks by freezing wind and sweat. I swiped a prepaid transit card I kept tucked in the back of my phone case, silently praying it still held a balance. The turnstile clicked open. I walked onto the train car and found a seat in the corner. The late-night passengers stared at me openly. A group of drunk college students whispered to each other, pointing at my ruined dress and laughing. Exhausted shift workers shook their heads in pity, assuming I was just another tragic story of a night gone wrong. I ignored all of them. I sat on the hard plastic seat, shivering uncontrollably, wrapping my arms tightly around my torso to shield the soggy passbook from view. It was my only anchor in a night that had completely destroyed my reality. I got off at my usual stop and walked 2 freezing blocks to my boutique floral shop. I did not have my keys. Bradley had them securely in his tuxedo pocket, another detail he had planned to ensure I had nowhere to go. But I knew this building better than anyone else in the world. I went to the dark back alley, moved a heavy ceramic planter aside, and retrieved the emergency spare key I kept hidden inside a magnetic lockbox. My hands shook so badly from the cold that I dropped the key twice before finally turning the lock. I slipped inside quickly and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me, leaning against the door as I caught my breath. The shop was dark and freezing, as I intentionally kept the heat low at night to preserve the fresh flowers. The familiar scent of eucalyptus, damp earth, and cut roses filled the air, a stark contrast to the absolute disaster of my current situation. I walked into the back workroom surrounded by large buckets of inventory meant for happy occasions, anniversaries, and celebrations I suddenly felt completely disconnected from. Having no other option for shelter, I pulled a tall stack of thick, rough burlap sacks from the metal storage rack and spread them across the cold concrete floor to create a barrier against the freezing ground. I lay down on the makeshift bed, wrapping the heavy torn layers of my wedding dress tightly around my legs, pulling more burlap over my shivering shoulders to trap whatever body heat I had left. My muscles ached from the intense shivering, and my bare feet were completely numb. I carefully set Grandpa Silas's passbook on my chest, holding it gently with both hands. The pages were still extremely damp, the cardboard cover heavily warped and discolored from the ice water my father had thrown it into. I ran my thumb over the faded texture. I had no idea how much money was actually inside it. Grandpa Silas lived a very quiet, modest life, rarely spending money on himself, so I realistically expected maybe a few $100s at best. But as I lay there freezing in the dark, listening to the harsh winter wind rattle the front shop windows, I made a firm, silent vow. I would go to the private bank the exact second the heavy brass doors opened in the morning. I would proudly cash out whatever meager amount my grandfather had carefully saved for me, use it to rent a cheap local motel room, and figure out exactly how to survive the week without relying on anyone else. I would rebuild my entire life from scratch if I had to. I would never let my father control my choices or humiliate me again, and I would make Bradley deeply regret the moment he chose cowardice and money over me. The morning sun pierced through the frosted glass of my shop windows, waking me from a stiff, restless sleep. My body ached severely from lying on the freezing concrete floor all night. I pushed the rough, scratchy burlap sacks aside and pulled myself up, my muscles screaming in absolute protest with every movement. The torn, muddy ruins of my silk wedding dress hung heavily around my legs, a bitter reminder of the betrayal I had just survived. I went to the small employee bathroom in the back, splashed freezing water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the tiny mirror. My bridal makeup was completely smeared across my cheeks, my eyes red, puffy, and hollow from crying. I looked like a tragic ghost of the happy bride I was supposed to be. I dug through the lost and found bin in the employee locker room and found an old, oversized beige trench coat one of my delivery drivers had left behind last winter. I wrapped it tightly around myself, buttoning it all the way up to my chin to hide the stained silk and torn lace of my ruined gown. I grabbed my grandfather's warped passbook from the counter, slipped it carefully into the deep pocket of the coat, and walked back out into the brutal, unrelenting Chicago wind. The destination was 10 blocks away in the heart of the bustling financial district. I walked the entire way, fueled entirely by a burning mix of adrenaline and the residual anger from being locked out of my own life. The freezing air whipped against my face, but I barely felt it. I approached the towering, polished brass doors of the oldest and most exclusive private bank in the city. The armed security guard standing at the entrance gave my wrinkled trench coat and disheveled appearance a highly suspicious, judgmental look. They clearly thought I was a vagrant trying to escape the cold, but I kept my chin raised high and walked straight past them with unwavering purpose. I had a mission to complete. The interior of the bank was a cavernous, intimidating hall of imported Italian marble, dark mahogany wood, detailing, and the hushed, wealthy conversations of the city elite. I completely ignored the stares of the impeccably dressed patrons and marched directly up to the main mahogany counter. A young teller in a crisp tailored navy suit looked up at me. Her polite customer service smile strained visibly as she took in my chaotic, unkempt appearance. I did not give her a single chance to ask questions or turn me away. I reached deep into my trench coat pocket, pulled out the damp, severely discolored cardboard passbook, and slid it firmly across the polished marble counter. "I need to cash this out immediately," I said, keeping my voice hard and steady, despite the intense shivering that still racked my freezing body. "Whatever the current balance is, I will take it all in cash right now." The teller picked up the soggy booklet with two manicured fingers, looking at the water damage as if it were a piece of filthy trash that had blown in from the street gutter. I could see the thick condescension in her eyes as she flipped open the cover. She typed the faded handwritten serial number into her sleek computer terminal, clearly expecting the banking system to reject it entirely or show a meager balance of $50. I stood tall, mentally preparing myself to take whatever small amount my grandfather had managed to save for me and use it to buy a hot meal and a cheap motel room. I was ready to start completely over. I watched the teller hit the enter key on her keyboard. The reaction was instantaneous and absolutely terrifying. The young woman abruptly stopped breathing. All the color instantly drained from her face in a split second, leaving her looking completely pale and sickly. Her eyes widened to an unnatural size as she stared intensely at her monitor, reading the confidential information on the screen. She looked down at the soggy cardboard passbook resting on the counter, then darted her eyes back up to the screen, her mouth opening and closing rapidly, without producing a single sound. Her hands began to shake violently, her fingers trembling against the keyboard. I watched in absolute confusion as she reached under the heavy marble counter and firmly pressed a hidden red button. It was the silent desk alarm. My heart dropped heavily into my stomach. I thought my father had already anticipated my move, flagged the account as stolen to punish me further, and sent the police to arrest me right here in the lobby. I took a quick step back, my muscles tensing, ready to turn and run out the front doors. The teller snapped her head up, her voice quivering with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Ma'am, please do not leave," she pleaded, her tone completely stripped of its earlier condescension and replaced with pure desperation. "Please stay exactly where you are." I froze in place, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Before I could demand an explanation from her, the heavy, solid oak doors of the executive suite at the very back of the bank flew wide open. A distinguished older man in a bespoke charcoal suit sprinted out into the main lobby. He did not walk quickly. He literally ran across the marble floor, his expensive leather shoes echoing loudly against the stone. This was Preston, the bank's elite senior trust lawyer and the man who handled the most powerful accounts in the city. He bypassed the confused security guards, rushed directly behind the teller counter, and looked closely at the computer screen. He gasped loudly, his eyes widening just like the teller's had. Preston immediately turned, pushed his way through the security gate, and stopped directly in front of me. To the absolute shock of the teller and every wealthy patron standing in the lobby, This powerful, untouchable executive bowed deeply to me in a show of profound respect. Ms. Natalie Preston said, his voice breathless and filled with profound reverence. Please forgive our hesitation and any disrespect. We have been waiting for this ledger to be presented to us for over a decade. I stared at him completely, bewildered by his sudden deference. Ledger? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. I just want to withdraw my grandfather's personal savings. Preston stood up straight, his expression deadly serious and entirely focused on me. Ms. Natalie, this is not a standard savings account. What you hold in your hand is the physical token for a multi-generational bearer trust. It is a financial int, so incredibly exclusive and powerful that whoever holds the physical book legally controls the entire entity without question. My mind raced trying to comprehend his words. How much is in it? I demanded. Preston stepped closer and lowered his voice, so only I could hear the devastating truth. The trust contains over $40 million in verified liquid cash assets. But much more importantly, he paused, a sharp calculating gleam appearing in his experienced eyes. This specific trust holds the primary debts and institutional liens on every single piece of commercial real estate currently developed by your father, Harrison. You do not just have $40 million in cash right now, Ms. Natalie. You legally own the crushing debt of your father's entire corporate empire. You own him. The words hung in the sterile air of the bank lobby, echoing in my mind like a thunderclap. I own him. I looked at Preston, studying his deadly serious expression. The crippling financial anxiety that had suffocated me for my entire adult life vanished in an instant, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated power. I did not ask for a single dollar in cash. I looked Preston directly in the eye and instructed him to secure the trust, freeze any immediate access to the bearer token for anyone but myself, and begin compiling the master deeds for every property my father falsely claimed as his own. I carefully placed the damp passbook inside a tamper-proof security vault Preston provided, signed the heavy stack of authorization forms, and walked back out through those heavy brass doors. The biting Chicago wind still howled through the financial district, but the freezing cold did not register anymore. I walked back toward my floral shop, with my head held high, my posture completely transformed. I was no longer the discarded daughter freezing in a torn wedding dress. I was the architect of my family's impending ruin, and I was going to dismantle their empire brick by brick, starting with the very ground they walked on. As I turned the corner onto my street, the familiar sight of my quaint floral boutique came into view, but my peaceful sanctuary had been invaded. An obnoxious matte black G-Wagon was parked illegally right across the sidewalk, completely blocking the entrance to my shop. The engine growled loudly, sending thick plumes of white exhaust into the freezing morning air, and the dark-tinted windows slowly rolled down. The heavy driver's side door swung open, and Dion stepped out onto the pavement. My African-American brother-in-law was the exact definition of an arrogant finance bro. He wore a razor-sharp custom-tailored suit that cost more than my entire monthly inventory budget, and a flashy, oversized gold watch glinted on his wrist. Dion managed the crypto portfolios and investment funds for my father's real estate firm, a position he leveraged to treat everyone around him like absolute garbage. He strutted across the pavement as if he owned the entire city block. From the passenger side, my younger sister Chelsea emerged. At 29 years old, she was my father's ultimate golden child, a woman who had never worked a single hard day in her entire life. She stepped onto the freezing sidewalk wearing designer winter boots and an expensive fur coat, instantly raising her smartphone to eye level. She was already recording a video, the camera lens pointed directly at my stained trench coat and ruined hair, eager to document my lowest moment. Her pristine, manufactured reality was about to crash directly into my new truth, and I would not offer her a shred of mercy. I unlocked the front door of my shop and pushed past them, walking straight to the main wooden counter where I had spent years building my business. Dion and Chelsea followed me inside, bringing the bitter cold and their suffocating entitlement into my workspace. Dion did not bother with pleasantries. He swaggered up to my cash register, reached inside his tailored jacket, and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He smirked, his eyes filled with a cruel, mocking delight, and forcefully slapped the paper down onto the counter right in front of me. It was a formal eviction notice stamped and signed by my father's real estate management company. "Dad told me to clear out the trash," Dion said, leaning his hands heavily on the counter and invading my personal space. "His company owns this building. Sorry about the wedding, but you have 48 hours to vacate your shop unless you crawl back and beg him." He tapped the eviction notice with his manicured finger, leaning closer so I could smell his expensive cologne. "If you are not out by then, I am bringing a crew to throw your dead flowers and your pathetic life into the dumpster out back. My father is done playing games with you, Natalie. You embarrassed him in front of his investors last night, and now you are going to pay the ultimate price." Chelsea circled the counter, shoving her smartphone camera practically into my face. She laughed, a shrill and grating sound designed perfectly for her social media followers. "Look at her." Chelsea sneered into the camera, broadcasting my humiliation to her thousands of subscribers. "The unhinged runaway bride. You really thought you could throw a tantrum at a $100,000 wedding and just get away with it? You look absolutely pathetic, Natalie. Sleeping in a dirty flower shop because your gold digger fiancé finally realized you are completely worthless without Dad's money. Why do you not just get on your knees right now, look into my camera, and beg Dad for forgiveness? Maybe he will let you keep a single bucket of roses to sell on the street corner." They fully expected me to break. They expected the tears to well up in my eyes, for my voice to crack, and for me to crumble under the crushing weight of losing my business just hours after losing my relationship. Dayon stood there waiting for the inevitable breakdown, crossing his arms over his chest in absolute triumph, while Chelsea eagerly kept her camera rolling, desperate to capture my total devastation for her digital audience. Instead, I looked down at the eviction notice resting on the counter. Then I looked up at Dayon, and a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I did not shed a single tear. I did not tremble. I stood perfectly still, radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence that immediately caused Dayon's arrogant smirk to falter. The knowledge of the $40 million trust and the crippling debt I now held over their heads burned brightly in my mind, an invisible shield against their pathetic bullying. I reached into the pocket of my oversized trench coat and pulled out my cell phone. I ignored Chelsea's camera entirely. I maintained unbroken deadpan eye contact with Dion as I swiped open my screen and dialed the private direct line to the bank. Preston answered on the very first ring, his professional tone echoing through the earpiece. "Preston," I said, keeping my voice low, dangerously calm, and perfectly steady. "Prepare the deeds. It is time to collect." 48 hours passed in a relentless, adrenaline-fueled blur of meticulous preparation. I did not sleep a single wink, and I certainly did not shed another tear over the family that had betrayed me. Instead, I spent every waking minute safely secured inside Preston's heavily guarded downtown office, signing an endless mountain of dense legal declarations. We worked tirelessly through the night, transferring the immense operational power of the Silas Bearer Trust entirely into my name. By the time the deadline on Dion's pathetic eviction notice finally expired, I was no longer the vulnerable, heartbroken florist operating under my father's oppressive thumb. I had become the absolute owner of the commercial ground beneath his feet, armed with enough financial leverage to crush his entire empire. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning. On the second day, the loud, obnoxious roar of a heavy engine announced Dion's arrival. I stood quietly inside my shop, gazing through the pristine front window. The same matte black SUV pulled up aggressively to the curb. This time, Dion brought an audience to witness my downfall. He stepped out of his luxury vehicle, accompanied by a burly, intimidating locksmith holding a heavy industrial drill and two massive movers wearing matching company jackets. Dion smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, cracking his knuckles with a predatory, expectant grin. He fully anticipated finding me barricaded inside, weeping over dying roses, begging him for a final extension. He swaggered confidently up to the front door and gestured for the locksmith to break the deadbolt. But before the man could even raise his heavy drill, two towering private security guards stepped out from the deep shadows of the adjacent alleyway. They wore tactical gear, their expressions carved from solid stone, and they immediately blocked the entrance to my shop, crossing their muscular arms. Dion halted instantly in his tracks, his arrogant smile faltering as confusion washed over his face. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the false authority he always wielded on behalf of my ruthless father. "Move out of the way right now," Dion barked, pointing a manicured finger at the guards. "I am a senior executive at the property management firm that owns this building. I have a legal eviction order for the delinquent tenant inside. If you do not step aside this second, I will have you both arrested for trespassing on corporate property." The security guards did not flinch. They did not even blink. Instead, the heavy glass door of my shop swung open, and Preston stepped out onto the freezing Chicago pavement. The elite trust lawyer looked absolutely impeccable in a charcoal pinstripe suit, carrying a thick leather-bound legal portfolio securely under his arm. I stepped out right behind him, wearing a sharp-tailored designer blazer I had purchased the day before. The ruined wedding dress was gone forever, and so was the terrified, obedient girl who had worn it. Preston adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at Dion with the kind of clinical, icy disgust usually reserved for scraping gum off a shoe. "You will not be arresting anyone today," Preston said, his voice cutting through the cold morning air with absolute, unyielding authority. "Furthermore, you will instruct your locksmith to step away from this door immediately. You are currently trespassing on private land, and we are well within our rights to have you physically removed by force." Dion laughed, a harsh, nervous sound that betrayed his sudden insecurity. He quickly pulled his crumpled eviction notice from his jacket pocket and waved it aggressively in the air. "Are you deaf, old man? I represent the actual owner. Harrison Development controls this entire city block. We are kicking this ungrateful brat to the curb, and there is nothing you can do about it." Preston did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. He simply opened his leather portfolio and extracted a pristine, heavy parchment document bearing a shimmering golden state seal. He held it up directly in front of Dion's face so he could clearly read the bold black print at the very top. "Harrison Development merely manages this property," Preston corrected, articulating each word slowly so the brutal reality could penetrate Dion's thick skull. "They are glorified janitors who collect the rent and fix leaky pipes. They do not own the bricks, they do not own the soil, and they certainly do not own this commercial building. The master deed belongs entirely to the Silas Bearer Trust. And as of yesterday morning, my client, Ms. Natalie, is the sole executing trustee and legal owner of this entire commercial block." Dion froze completely. The breath visibly hitched in his throat. He stared at the golden seal on the master deed, his dark eyes frantically scanning the dense legal jargon that completely dismantled his entire reality in a matter of seconds. The color drained rapidly from his face, leaving him looking suddenly hollow and sickly. He looked at the heavy drill resting in the locksmith's hand, then back up at the armed security guards, slowly realizing that his fabricated power had just evaporated into the freezing winter wind. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing less than 2 feet away from my stunned brother-in-law. The smug, bullying predator who had slapped that paper on my counter 2 days ago was completely gone, replaced by a sweating, panicked fraud. I reached out and calmly plucked the crumpled eviction notice right out of his trembling fingers. I looked him dead in the eye, gripped the paper with both hands, and ripped it directly down the middle. I tore the halves again, letting the shredded pieces flutter down onto the slush-covered pavement between our feet like dirty confetti. Dion swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he took a slight step backward. "Natalie, listen," he stammered, his confident tone replaced by a high-pitched, nervous squeak. "This was just a misunderstanding. Harrison told me to come down here and enforce the company policy. I was just following orders. I was just doing my job." I did not let him finish his pathetic, cowardly backtrack. I reached into the deep pocket of my blazer and pulled out a crisp, freshly printed document of my own. I slapped it forcefully against his chest, forcing him to grab it before it fell into the slush. "Your crypto brokerage leases the entire 3rd floor of this exact building, right?" I asked, my voice dripping with cold, calculated venom. "The massive office with the panoramic windows, where you lose millions of dollars pretending to be a financial genius while playing with other people's money." Dion stared down at the paper in his hands, his eyes widening in absolute unadulterated horror as he read the bold legal heading at the top of the page. Congratulations, Dion, I said, leaning in so he could hear every single syllable clearly over the rushing wind. You are officially evicted. You have exactly 24 hours to pack up your flashy suits and vacate my property. If a single one of your computer servers is still plugged into my walls by tomorrow morning at 9, I will have these armed guards personally throw them out the third-floor window onto the street. Dion's mouth opened and closed silently, unable to form a coherent response. The tough guy facade shattered completely into a million jagged pieces. He looked at the burly movers he had hired to destroy my life, realizing they were now entirely useless to him. His hands shook violently as he fumbled for his cell phone in his expensive suit pocket, nearly dropping the device on the concrete sidewalk. He frantically dialed my father's private number, pressing the phone incredibly hard against his ear. Harrison Dion yelled into the receiver, his voice cracking with pure, unfiltered panic as he backed away toward his ridiculous black SUV. We have a massive problem down here. She has lawyers. She owns the entire building. Harrison, pick up the phone right now. I stood proudly on the sidewalk, flanked by my brilliant legal counsel and my towering private security, and watched my arrogant brother-in-law scramble into his vehicle like a terrified rat fleeing a sinking ship. The large tires of his G-Wagon squealed loudly against the icy pavement as he sped away from the curb, leaving his bewildered locksmith and movers completely stranded on the sidewalk. I took a deep, deeply satisfying breath of the freezing Chicago air. The first strike had landed perfectly, but I was not even close to being finished. I turned to Preston, a genuine, dangerous smile finally touching my lips. Let us go review the financial ledgers, I said. I want to see exactly how much money my father has been stealing from his own company, and I want to bleed him entirely dry. The financial ledgers were a labyrinth of corporate deceit. But before Preston and I could even begin unraveling my father's extensive financial crimes, my phone began vibrating off the heavy mahogany desk. It did not stop. Notification after notification flooded my screen in a relentless digital avalanche. Unable to win a single legal battle against my ironclad trust documents, Chelsea and Dion had immediately weaponized the only domain they still controlled: the internet. Chelsea had uploaded a highly edited, heavily filtered video across all her social media platforms. I tapped the screen and watched my sister put on the performance of a lifetime. She sat on the floor of her luxury walk-in closet, wearing an oversized sweater, forcing fake tears to stream down her perfectly contoured cheeks. She stared directly into the camera, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. She told her millions of followers that her older sister had suffered a massive, violent psychotic break at the altar. She claimed I had completely lost my mind, manipulated our elderly grandfather, who was allegedly suffering from severe dementia, and stolen his entire life savings. But the most malicious lie was saved for her husband. Chelsea sobbed loudly, claiming I was using that stolen money to illegally evict her hardworking African-American husband out of pure, deep-seated racial prejudice. She spun a vile, entirely fabricated narrative that I was a racist, unhinged monster, determined to destroy a successful minority business owner. The video went incredibly viral within hours. My phone froze as thousands of hateful comments poured in from outraged strangers who believed every single word of her toxic performance. But the digital assault did not stop there. Seeing an opportunity to capitalize on the viral outrage and secure his own 15 minutes of fame, my cowardly ex-fiancé Bradley jumped right into the spotlight. Less than a day later, he appeared as a special guest on a highly popular local Chicago podcast. I listened to the audio clip as I paced my shop. Bradley played the role of the heartbroken, traumatized victim to absolute perfection. He sat behind the microphone and shamelessly lied to thousands of listeners, claiming he was the primary financial provider for our entire relationship. He painted me as a manipulative, gold-digging psychopath who violently snapped at the wedding reception the exact moment I realized I could not bleed his personal bank accounts dry anymore. The podcast host eagerly validated his lies, fueling the online mob that was already tearing my name apart. The digital smear campaign instantly manifested into dangerous real-world consequences. Within a matter of hours, my pristine 5-star business rating plummeted. Thousands of fake reviews flooded my Google and Yelp pages, tanking my floral boutique down to a single star. My business phone rang incessantly with automated death threats and screaming voicemails from internet vigilantes who bought into Chelsea's racial discrimination narrative. Then the digital violence turned physical. That night, a heavy cinder block came crashing straight through the main display window of my floral shop, showering the interior with thousands of jagged glass shards. A massive bucket of neon red paint was hurled through the broken opening, splashing violently across my delicate white orchids and ruining my expensive display counters. The word psycho was spray painted in crude, jagged letters across the remaining glass. I stood in the center of my ruined shop the next morning, my boots crunching over the broken glass. Preston stood beside me, looking deeply concerned by the vandalism. I did not shed a single tear over the destroyed flowers or the hateful graffiti. I simply instructed my private security guards to board up the shattered window and told Preston to completely ignore the pathetic public relations nightmare. We were not going to fight them on social media. We were going to destroy them in federal court. But before I could hand Preston the next stack of financial audits to review, my cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen. It was Chicago Memorial Hospital. I swiped to answer, expecting a routine update on my grandfather's mild recovery. Instead, the frantic, panicked voice of the intensive care head nurse echoed through the speaker. "Natalie, you need to get down here immediately," the nurse shouted over the chaotic sounds of medical alarms blaring loudly in the background. "It is your grandfather. He is crashing." My blood ran completely cold. "What happened?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the phone until my knuckles turned white. "He was stable yesterday." "It was your father," the nurse explained, her voice trembling with intense stress. "Harrison completely bypassed our front desk security. He forced his way into the intensive care unit with two aggressive corporate lawyers. They cornered your grandfather in his bed." Harrison was screaming at him, physically pinning the frail old man down by his shoulders and violently shoving a pen into his hand. "He was aggressively trying to force your grandfather to sign a document voiding his trust rights." The severe physical and emotional assault triggered a massive catastrophic stroke. "Hospital security just dragged your father out of the building in handcuffs, but Silas is completely unresponsive. We are losing him." The phone slipped from my ear, dropping heavily onto the glass-covered floor of my shop. The noise of the city outside seemed to fade into a complete, deafening silence. Harrison had crossed the ultimate line. He was no longer just a greedy, manipulative businessman protecting his wealth. He had actively, violently endangered the life of the only person in this world who had ever shown me genuine love, all to save his own pathetic empire from financial ruin. Pure, blinding fury ignited inside my chest, burning away any lingering shreds of familial obligation I might have subconsciously harbored. I looked at Preston, who immediately recognized the lethal shift in my demeanor. I pointed at the door, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm register. "Get the security detail into the armored SUVs right now. We are going to the hospital." And Preston called the federal authorities on the way. My father just signed his own death warrant. The armored SUVs screeched loudly against the pavement at Chicago Memorial Hospital. I shoved the heavy door open and sprinted through the sliding glass doors, Preston and my two private security guards flanking me perfectly. We bypassed the reception desk entirely, taking the service elevator straight to the intensive care unit. The blindingly white hallway came into focus, and my blood boiled at the sight waiting for me. In front of the wooden door leading to my grandfather's room stood a human barricade. Harrison, Chelsea, and Dion had linked their arms together, blocking the entrance. Chelsea was aggressively wiping away fake tears for the passing nurses, while Dion glared at me, trying to regain his shattered pride. Harrison was the ringleader. His expensive tailored suit was disheveled, and he was sweating profusely. He looked exactly like a cornered, desperate animal. When he saw me marching down the corridor, Harrison puffed out his chest and waved a crumpled stack of legal papers. "Stop right there," Natalie, Harrison bellowed, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. "You are banned from this wing. I am his only son, and I hold the legal medical power of attorney. The doctors are evaluating his mental competency right now. The second they declare him unfit, I am legally voiding whatever fraudulent documents he gave you. You will not get a single cent of my inheritance." A week ago, standing in front of my enraged father would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have backed down, cried, or begged for his permission to see my grandfather. But the woman standing in the intensive care hallway today was devoid of fear. I did not scream back or shed a tear. I stopped walking, firmly crossed my arms over my chest, and stared at him with freezing disdain. I did not dignify his desperate outburst with a verbal response. Instead, I gave a sharp nod to my right. Preston stepped forward, radiating the cold authority of a man who handled billion-dollar estates. He was accompanied by the hospital's chief of medicine and 4 armed security officers, alerted to the escalating situation. Harrison smirked, assuming the hospital staff were there to throw me out. He shoved his medical power of attorney aggressively toward the chief of medicine. "Read it," Harrison commanded arrogantly. "I have absolute authority over Silas. Throw this ungrateful brat out of the building before I call the police." The chief of medicine ignored Harrison's crumpled paperwork. Instead, he respectfully turned to Preston. The trust lawyer opened his leather briefcase and extracted a preserved legal portfolio sealed with a federal stamp. He handed it to the chief of medicine. "What you are holding, Mr. Harrison, is entirely worthless," Preston stated, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor blade. "3 years ago, Silas anticipated that you might attempt a hostile medical takeover to seize his financial assets. He retained my firm to draft a supreme guardianship directive at the federal level. It explicitly and permanently revokes any medical, legal, and financial proxy you might claim to possess. It specifically names Natalie as his sole, untouchable guardian across all jurisdictions." Harrison froze completely. The triumphant smirk melted right off his face, replaced by a sickly, horrified pallor. He snatched his hand back as if the standard power of attorney had suddenly caught fire. The chief of medicine reviewed the federal seal and immediately nodded to the hospital security team. "Mr. Harrison, your presence here is a direct violation of federal guardianship orders," the doctor said sternly. "You and your family will vacate this floor immediately, or you will be arrested for trespassing and severe medical interference." Dion attempted to puff out his chest, stepping aggressively toward the doctor, but the security officers instantly drew their batons and forced him back against the wall. Chelsea shrieked loudly, dropping her fake crying act entirely. She stomped her designer boots against the floor as 2 female officers physically corralled her away from the door, threatening to place her in handcuffs if she continued to resist. Harrison stood paralyzed, his eyes darting frantically between me, Preston, and the heavy federal document that had stripped away his final piece of leverage. He was completely out of options, out of money, and out of power. The security team grabbed him firmly by the arms, physically forcing him away from the entrance. He thrashed against their grip, screaming my name, threatening to destroy my life, but his vicious words were utterly powerless now. I did not look back at them as they were dragged toward the freight elevators. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to the intensive care room and stepped inside. The chaotic noise of the hallway instantly vanished, replaced by the steady beeping of heart monitors. Grandpa Silas lay on the hospital bed, an oxygen mask covering his pale face, his frail body surrounded by a maze of medical tubes and wires. I slowly walked directly to his bedside, my heart aching at the sight of the strong man who saved my life reduced to this fragile state. I reached out and gently took his trembling, weathered hand in mine. His eyes fluttered open, struggling against the strong medical sedatives. He looked at me, a faint, reassuring squeeze coming from his fingers. I leaned down, pressing my forehead gently against his knuckles. "Rest now, Grandpa," I whispered, keeping my voice soft, but infused with a lethal, unbreakable promise. "You do not have to fight him anymore. I have the passbook. I have secured the trust. And I promise you, by the time the sun rises tomorrow, there will be nothing left of his empire." I stood up straight, carefully placing his hand back on the warm bed. I turned my back to the heart monitors and walked out of the room, shutting the heavy wooden door firmly behind me. The era of playing defense was permanently over. The absolute unmerciful offense against my family had officially begun. I stepped out of the hospital into the freezing Chicago evening, dialing Preston before the sliding doors even closed behind me. We needed a war room. Within an hour, I was standing inside the secure, soundproof conference center on the top floor of Preston's bank. The long mahogany table was already covered in high-powered laptops and glowing monitors. Using the limitless financial resources of the Silas Bearer Trust, Preston had assembled a ruthless team of elite forensic accountants. These were not standard bookkeepers. They were former federal investigators and corporate bloodhounds who specialized in tearing apart shell companies and tracking hidden assets. I stood at the head of the table looking at the team of seasoned professionals. I want every single transaction, every hidden ledger, and every offshore account connected to Harrison Development and Dion's crypto brokerage stripped bare. I commanded, keeping my voice hard and sharp. Find me the rot. Because the bearer trust held the primary institutional liens on all of my father's commercial properties, we had the immediate legal authority to demand full unredacted access to his corporate financial records. The accountants did not hesitate. Their fingers flew across their keyboards, slicing through my father's flimsy corporate firewalls and extracting years of financial history. I paced the length of the conference room, fueled by black coffee and the burning desire to completely dismantle the men who had tormented me. It took less than 6 hours for the pristine facade of Harrison Development to completely collapse under the weight of professional scrutiny. Just before dawn, the lead forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman in a tailored gray suit, slammed her hand down on the table. She quickly connected her laptop to the massive projector screen mounted on the wall. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark room with a dizzying web of red numbers, offshore wire transfers, and falsified balance sheets. "Your brother-in-law is not a financial genius," the lead accountant stated, pointing a laser pointer directly at a massive cluster of red transactions. "He is a catastrophic failure. Dion's crypto brokerage is nothing but a hollow shell. Over the last 18 months, he made a series of incredibly reckless, high-risk cryptocurrency trades that completely tanked. He lost virtually everything he touched." I stared at the screen, watching the digital proof of Dion's sheer incompetence. "But my father is obsessed with wealth." I countered, my eyes scanning the massive losses. Harrison would never tolerate a loser managing his corporate funds. Why would he keep Dion around instead of throwing him to the wolves the second his portfolio dropped into the red? "Because Harrison is drowning right alongside him," the accountant replied coldly. She clicked a button and a new set of ledgers appeared on the screen. These documents were hidden deep within the private servers of Harrison Development, intentionally masked under layers of fake vendor invoices and phantom construction costs. I stepped closer to the screen, my blood running ice cold as I read the headers on the accounts. These were not standard corporate operational funds or real estate escrow accounts. They were the employee pension funds, the retirement savings of the hundreds of construction workers, secretaries, and project managers who had dedicated their entire lives to building my father's empire. "Look at the dates," Preston said, stepping up beside me, his voice laced with pure professional disgust. "Every time Dion suffered a massive crypto loss, your father authorized an illegal backdoor wire transfer from the employee pension funds to artificially inflate Dion's brokerage accounts and hide the missing money. They have been quietly embezzling from their own loyal employees for over a year to cover up Dion's sheer stupidity." The sheer scale of the betrayal made me physically nauseous. My father was not just a cruel parent. He was a federal criminal actively robbing working-class families of their entire future to protect his arrogant son-in-law and his own pristine reputation. He had fired loyal employees, claiming budget cuts, while simultaneously funneling their retirement cash into Dion's digital garbage fire. The lead accountant hit one final button, summarizing the complex web of illegal transfers into a single glaring red number at the very bottom of the screen. "The missing deficit is exactly $15 million, the accountant declared, staring directly at me. "And here is the kill shot. The Federal Regulatory Commission notified Harrison Development last month that they are scheduled for a comprehensive compliance audit by the end of this quarter." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with deafening clarity. The forced smile at my $100,000 wedding. The desperate rush to merge my life with Bradley, a man he could easily control. The violent assault on my grandfather in the hospital room. It all made perfect, horrifying sense. "I was out of time," I said, my voice echoing in the silent conference room. He knew the federal auditors would discover the missing pension funds. If he did not plug a $15 million crater immediately, both he and Dion would be going straight to federal prison for embezzlement. Preston nodded grimly, crossing his arms. He needed Silas to die, or he needed to force your grandfather to sign over control of the bearer trust. $40 million in liquid cash would have easily allowed him to quietly replace the stolen employee pensions hide, Dion's catastrophic losses, and pass the federal audit without raising a single red flag. Your grandfather handing you that passbook at the wedding did not just ruin his pride. It completely derailed his criminal cover-up. I looked at the $15 million deficit glaring in neon red on the projector screen. My father had literally cornered a frail 85-year-old man in a hospital bed willing to cause a fatal stroke just to save his own skin from a federal indictment. Chelsea had mocked me online playing the victim, while her husband actively stole millions from blue-collar workers. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they could bully, manipulate, and steal their way out of any consequence because they had always hidden behind the power of their wealth. But they no longer held the power. I did. I turned away from the projector screen and looked directly at Preston. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Chicago skyline, casting a sharp, unforgiving light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the war room. Print out every single one of those wire transfers, I instructed Preston, my tone devoid of any mercy. Certify the ledgers, bundle the evidence, and prepare the official lien execution notices. I am not just going to shut down his business. I am going to publicly rip the mask off his entire life. Preston gave a sharp affirmative nod, immediately instructing the forensic accountants to start compiling the hard copies. What is our next move? Ms. Natalie Preston asked, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a lethal legal strike against his corrupt rivals. We cut his oxygen, I replied coldly, grabbing my blazer from the back of my chair. Freeze all of his corporate lines of credit immediately. Let him feel the walls closing in. By 9 o'clock that very morning, the lethal legal machinery of the Silas Bearer Trust sprang into absolute action. Preston stood at his expansive mahogany desk, operating a multi-line secure phone, personally contacting the presidents of every major financial institution connected to Harrison Development. As the primary lien holder, I possessed the unilateral authority to halt any further financial bleeding. I sat in a high-backed leather chair across from Preston, sipping my black coffee as I signed order after order. We systematically executed the freeze protocols, every single corporate line of credit, every revolving loan facility, and every escrow account. Linked to my father's vast real estate empire was instantly frozen solid. The banking executives did not argue with us. The verified forensic ledgers showing massive irregularities, combined with the ironclad authority of my grandfather's trust, terrified them into immediate compliance. They locked down the accounts to protect their own corporate liabilities. I watched the digital confirmation receipts flood into Preston's secure terminal. Red-locked icons appeared next to every single one of Harrison's corporate bank accounts. We had successfully severed his financial jugular. My father could no longer withdraw a single cent to cover his payroll, pay his vendors, or artificially prop up Dion's failing crypto investments. He was financially paralyzed, trapped entirely within the invisible cage I had just built around him. The catastrophic ripple effects hit the freezing streets of Chicago before lunchtime. Harrison Development had 3 massive luxury high-rise projects actively under construction in the downtown sector. Without access to their credit lines, the automated daily payroll transfers failed to clear. The heavy machinery went completely silent. Crane operators shut down their massive engines, leaving steel beams dangling uselessly in midair. Foremen blew their whistles, ordering their specialized crews to drop their tools and step away from the active zones. Hundreds of angry, unpaid subcontractors literally walked off the job sites, leaving half-built concrete skeletons abandoned against the gray winter sky. Suppliers immediately stopped their delivery trucks en route, turning around the second their finance departments realized Harrison's corporate credit cards were declining across the board. The mighty engine of Harrison Development ground to a humiliating, screeching halt. The panic was even more brutal inside Dion's flashy third-floor brokerage. I stayed in Preston's office and listened to the live reports coming in from my private security team stationed outside my floral shop. Dion's phone was ringing incessantly, blowing up with aggressive margin calls from furious institutional investors who smelled blood in the water. His artificially inflated crypto portfolios were in a total freefall, and the illegal safety net of the employee pension funds was now firmly locked behind my strict security protocols. He could not access the stolen money to cover his terrible trades. Dion was pacing frantically near the panoramic glass windows of his leased office, tearing at his custom-tailored suit, screaming obscenities at his glowing computer screens. He had 24 hours left on my eviction notice, but the financial market was evicting him from reality much faster. I was completely exposed, a fraudulent broker drowning in his own catastrophic debt. Chelsea was allegedly in the office with him, sobbing hysterically as she watched her husband's fake empire burn to the ground, realizing her unlimited shopping sprees were permanently canceled. Inside the polished glass walls of his corporate headquarters, Harrison was suffocating. I received a forwarded email from a sympathetic mole inside his accounting department, detailing the absolute chaos unfolding in his executive suite. My father was throwing office furniture against the walls, firing innocent executives who brought him the bad news, and screaming into his phone at bank managers who flatly refused to bypass my freeze orders. I knew the federal compliance audit was looming closer every single hour. He knew the $15 million gap in the employee pension fund was a ticking time bomb that would put him behind bars for the rest of his natural life. His back was entirely against the wall, but instead of surrendering to the authorities, the cornered animal made one final, incredibly desperate move. Harrison decided to play the only card he had left, the grand illusion of extreme wealth. He immediately directed his marketing team to aggressively push forward his highly publicized annual charity gala scheduled for the upcoming weekend. He emptied out the very last of his hidden, unrestricted personal liquid assets, pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into securing the most opulent ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton. He ordered premium vintage champagne, wildly expensive floral arrangements, and top-tier musical entertainment. It was a massive, glittering facade designed strictly to deceive the public eye. The charity gala was not about philanthropy or giving back to the community. It was a calculated, desperate trap to lure in wealthy foreign venture capitalists and overseas real estate tycoons who were completely unaware of his domestic financial ruin. Harrison planned to use the flashy party to project absolute financial dominance, dazzle these new investors with heavily doctored prospectus reports, and secure a massive emergency cash injection. He intended to take their upfront investment capital, use it to illegally plug the $15 million hole in the pension fund before the federal auditors arrived, and delay his inevitable prison sentence. He truly believed he could lie his way out of a federal crisis by throwing a spectacular, overpriced party for the city elite. My father was preparing to put on the performance of a lifetime, entirely unaware that I already held the script, the stage, and the match that would burn his fraudulent theater to the ground. I instructed my security team to gather the accountants. We were going to a party. I grabbed my tailored blazer from the chair and checked my reflection. The frightened bride was dead. I smiled, ready to deliver the final blow. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom was a masterclass in calculated deception. From the outside, the annual charity gala looked like the absolute pinnacle of Chicago high society. Enormous cascading crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive, and inviting glow over the massive space, reflecting beautifully off the towering pyramids of imported champagne glasses. My father had spared absolutely no expense for his final illusion. I stood quietly in the darkened hallway just outside the main entrance, watching the live security feed on Preston's encrypted tablet. The camera panned slowly across the crowded floor, revealing my family eagerly playing their designated roles in this fraudulent theater. Chelsea was holding court near a massive, intricately carved ice sculpture. She was draped in heavily insured designer diamonds, laughing loudly and playing the role of the carefree billionaire heiress to absolute perfection. She clinked crystal flutes with the wives of overseas shipping magnates, desperately trying to maintain her flawless social media persona while her husband's financial reality burned to ashes around them. Bradley was there too, wearing a rented designer tuxedo and sipping a dry martini. My cowardly ex-fiancé was aggressively networking near the private VIP tables, handing out freshly printed business cards, and loudly bragging about his close association with the Harrison development empire. He looked incredibly pleased with himself, completely unaware that the empire he had sold his soul to join was currently running on empty fumes and facing absolute collapse. But the panic was highly visible if you knew exactly where to look. Dion stood near the back bar, sweating profusely through his dark, custom-tailored suit. He kept wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief, frantically checking his phone for urgent margin call alerts while desperately trying to corner a group of wealthy venture capitalists from Dubai. He was speaking entirely too fast, his hands shaking visibly as he aggressively pushed them to review his fabricated cryptocurrency portfolios. He knew the clock was ticking down to his complete destruction. A sharp melodic chime echoed through the ballroom, signaling the main event of the evening. The ambient classical music faded away, and a bright spotlight snapped directly onto the center stage. Harrison stepped up to the clear acrylic podium, adjusting his silk tie and flashing his signature magnetic smile. He looked like the absolute picture of corporate stability, power, and success. My father gripped the edges of the podium, projecting a false, overwhelming confidence that had successfully fooled countless people over the decades. He welcomed the large crowd cheeringly, thanking the foreign dignitaries and wealthy investors for attending his highly exclusive charity event. Then he seamlessly and expertly pivoted to the hard pitch. He began aggressively selling his company as the absolute safest, most lucrative real estate investment in the entire Midwest. He confidently pointed to massive digital screens behind him, displaying gorgeous high-resolution architectural renderings of towering glass skyscrapers. He completely omitted the fact that those exact construction sites were currently abandoned, locked down by furious unpaid subcontractors who had walked off the job that very morning. He spoke eloquently about unprecedented financial returns and guaranteed quarterly dividends lying effortlessly through his teeth to the very people he desperately needed to bail him out of a looming federal indictment. I watched the wealthy foreign investors sitting at the prominent front tables. They were nodding along in agreement, completely charmed and disarmed by his flawless, practiced performance. A dedicated team of legal aides began moving through the room, distributing thick leather-bound binders directly to the VIP tables. These were the finalized term sheets. Harrison was forcefully pushing them to sign immediate equity partnerships tonight, demanding massive upfront cash deposits to secure their exclusive positions in his fake luxury developments. The foreign investors reached into their tailored jackets and pulled out their expensive fountain pens. My father was literally minutes away from securing the exact signatures he needed to inject millions of dollars into his frozen accounts. I was moments away from plugging the massive $15 million hole in the employee pension fund and walking away from his crimes completely scot-free. He smiled down at the captivated crowd, arrogantly believing he had successfully outsmarted the federal auditors, the banking executives, and his own daughter. I tapped Preston on the shoulder and handed him back the encrypted tablet. The time for silent observation was permanently over. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored razor-sharp designer suit. I had completely shed the soft, approachable floral apron of the woman they all thought they could step on, manipulate, and discard at will. Tonight, I was the sole executing trustee of a $40 million financial weapon, and I dressed for absolute corporate warfare. I signaled to the serious group standing tightly behind me. Preston stood firmly at my right, holding the thick, heavy portfolio of certified forensic ledgers. On my left stood the lead forensic accountant, carrying the digital flash drive loaded with the unredacted proof of their massive embezzlement scheme. Flanking us on either side were two broad-shouldered, intimidating plainclothes FBI agents, their gold federal badges discreetly but visibly clipped to their leather belts. I reached out and firmly grasped the heavy brass handles of the grand ballroom doors. I took one final steadying breath, letting the righteous anger fuel my movements. With one forceful, coordinated push, I shoved the massive wooden doors completely open. They slammed loudly against the interior walls, the sharp, thunderous noise echoing across the entire silent ballroom and instantly cutting through my father's charismatic speech. Every single head in the opulent room turned sharply toward the back entrance. The foreign investors slowly lowered their pens. Chelsea gasped loudly, her crystal champagne glass slipping from her manicured fingers and shattering violently against the polished marble floor. Bradley choked heavily on his martini, his eyes bugging out of his head as he recognized me. Dion froze entirely near the bar, the remaining color draining rapidly from his sweating face as he spotted the federal agents. I stepped confidently over the threshold and walked deliberately onto the plush carpet of the ballroom. I did not break my stride. I marched directly up the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the floor, leading my specialized execution squad straight toward the brightly lit center stage to finally end his reign. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished marble floor. The wealthy investors seated at the VIP tables stared at me in stunned confusion, their expensive fountain pens hovering frozen above their term sheets. I kept my chin raised, my eyes locked dead onto my father standing behind the clear acrylic podium. The charismatic, confident mask he had worn just seconds ago was rapidly fracturing. The color drained from his face as he processed the sight of Preston and the federal agents flanking my purposeful stride. Harrison recovered his voice, desperate to maintain control of his fraudulent narrative. Security Harrison bellowed into the microphone, his voice echoing frantically across the crystal chandeliers. Remove this woman immediately. She is a disturbed individual trespassing on a private corporate event. Get her out of here right now. 4 massive private security guards in black suits detached from the perimeter of the room and rushed toward the center aisle to intercept me. They reached out with thick arms, fully intending to drag me out of the ballroom by physical force. They never even got close. The 2 plainclothes FBI agents stepped smoothly in front of me. In perfect unison, they flipped open their leather credentials, flashing their gold federal badges directly under the bright ballroom spotlights. Federal agents, the taller agent announced, his voice projecting a lethal, unquestionable authority. Step away from her immediately and do not interfere with an active federal operation. The private security guards stopped dead in their tracks. They instantly raised their hands in surrender and backed away rapidly, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a federal crime. The wealthy investors in the front row began muttering urgently to one another, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. Several of them quietly closed their leather portfolios and pushed their term sheets away. I walked up the carpeted stairs and stepped directly onto the center stage. Harrison tried to physically block the podium, his face twisted in a mixture of pure hatred and primal fear. Preston stepped seamlessly between us, using his broad shoulders to physically box my father out of the way. I stepped up to the acrylic podium, reached down, and violently yanked the audio cable straight out of my father's microphone. The sudden, screeching feedback of the disconnected audio made several people in the audience cover their ears. I pulled a sleek wireless microphone from the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and switched it on. The green indicator light flared to life. "Thank you all for coming," I said, my voice echoing with crystal clear, unwavering command across the massive, breathless ballroom. "My father just told you about the incredible returns of his company. He pitched you a flawless vision of guaranteed dividends and towering luxury developments. Allow me to show you how he actually funds them." I reached out my open hand, and the lead forensic accountant placed a sleek silver flash drive into my palm. I plugged it directly into the master control terminal built into the side of the podium. I bypassed his marketing presentation with a few quick keystrokes. The massive 40-foot digital screens towering behind Harrison, which had been displaying beautiful fake architectural renderings of glass skyscrapers, suddenly flickered and went entirely pitch black. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of attendees as the screens flared back to life. They were no longer looking at luxury real estate. They were looking at high-resolution, heavily certified, and completely unredacted financial ledgers. I pressed a button on the podium console highlighting specific rows of data in glaring neon red. "What you are looking at on the screen behind me is not a construction escrow account," I announced, projecting my voice to the very back of the room, where Dion was currently sweating through his custom suit. "These are the internal employee pension funds of Harrison Development. the retirement savings of the blue-collar workers who built this company. And as you can clearly see by the authorized wire transfers highlighted in red, these funds are not resting in a secure bank. I clicked to the next slide. The screen displayed a split image. On the left were the exact dates and times of catastrophic cryptocurrency market crashes. On the right were matching to the exact minute offshore wire transfers, moving millions of dollars directly into digital wallets. Every time my brother-in-law, Dion, suffered a massive loss in his highly volatile, unregulated crypto brokerage, my father illegally authorized a backdoor wire transfer from the employee pension fund to cover the deficit I declared, making sure the foreign investors heard every single damning word. I pointed directly at the glaring red numbers at the bottom of the ledger. The money you are being asked to invest tonight is not going toward laying the foundation for a new skyscraper. It is desperately needed to plug a $15 million criminal crater before the Federal Regulatory Commission conducts their compliance audit at the end of this quarter. You are not investing in a legacy. You are actively funding a sinking Ponzi scheme. Down on the ballroom floor, Chelsea shrieked loudly, the reality of her collapsing luxury lifestyle finally hitting her. She dropped to her knees in her expensive designer gown, sobbing hysterically as her wealthy friends backed away from her in absolute disgust. Bradley, realizing the money he had sold me out for was entirely fake, turned pale and tried to slink out the side door, desperate to avoid the impending legal fallout. Harrison lunged frantically at the podium, desperately clawing at the computer terminal in a pathetic attempt to rip the flash drive out of the port. The taller FBI agent grabbed Harrison by the back of his expensive suit jacket and forcefully yanked him away from the console, pinning his arms firmly behind his back. The evidence remained frozen on the massive 40-foot screens looming over my father, like a digital executioner exposing the absolute, undeniable truth of his ruined empire to the entire world. The FBI agent held Harrison firmly in place, his tailored jacket wrinkling under the federal grip. I turned my attention back to the sea of horrified faces below me. The massive digital screens behind my back cast a harsh, unforgiving red glow over the entire ballroom, painting the crystal chandeliers and the white floral arrangements in the color of my father's financial crimes. I gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, making sure my voice remained perfectly level and amplified across the dead silent room. A $15 million deficit, I stated, staring directly into the eyes of the lead foreign investor sitting at the center VIP table. That is what you are being asked to cover tonight. You are not investing in premium commercial real estate. You are funding a desperate, collapsing Ponzi scheme built entirely on the backs of hardworking employees who trusted this man with their futures. The words landed like physical blows in the silent ballroom. I watched the lead investor, a billionaire real estate tycoon from Dubai, who had been moments away from wiring millions of dollars, slowly lower his gold fountain pen. He stared at the unredacted wire transfers displayed on the 40-foot screens, his expert eyes quickly validating the forensic data my team had meticulously compiled. The undeniable proof of embezzlement was right there in front of him, tracking the exact flow of stolen pension funds into volatile offshore cryptocurrency accounts. The absolute realization of the fraud hit the VIP tables first, and the reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The lead investor stood up abruptly, his heavy chair scraping violently against the marble floor. He picked up the thick leather-bound term sheet Harrison had handed him earlier. With a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, he ripped the heavy contract straight down the middle. He tossed the torn pieces onto the table, turned his back on the stage, and signaled his entire entourage to leave the building immediately. That single action broke the dam. The ballroom erupted into absolute deafening chaos. Wealthy dignitaries and elite venture capitalists scrambled to their feet, shouting angrily at my father's panicked legal aides. Dozens of lucrative investment contracts were thrown onto the floor, abandoned and shredded by the very people Harrison relied upon to save him. The mass exodus began. Hundreds of Chicago's wealthiest society members pushed toward the grand exit doors, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a federal financial scandal. Whispers and gasps echoed loudly among the socialites, who remained frozen at the edges of the room. The local elite people who had kissed my father's ring for decades were now actively pulling out their phones, snapping photos of the federal evidence on the screens, and frantically texting their wealth managers. The pristine, untouchable reputation of the Harrison family was disintegrating in real time. Everyone in that room realized simultaneously that Harrison was not a titan of industry. He was broke, he was a criminal, and his empire was nothing but a hollow shell. Behind me, the physical toll of his complete destruction finally hit my father. Harrison gasped for air, his face turning a dangerous mottled shade of purple. The arrogant defiance that had fueled his entire life vanished, replaced by sheer suffocating panic. He clutched his chest with a trembling hand, his legs buckling beneath him as the reality of his impending federal prison sentence crushed his spirit. The taller FBI agent easily supported his dead weight, lowering my gasping father into a nearby chair to prevent him from hitting the stage floor. His empire had completely evaporated in front of his eyes in less than 5 minutes. Down on the chaotic ballroom floor, the golden child finally snapped. Chelsea had spent her entire life hiding behind a carefully curated, flawless social media persona, pretending to be the epitome of grace and luxury. But stripped of her unlimited credit cards and her father's protective wealth, the ugly, entitled reality of her true nature clawed its way to the surface. She scrambled up from the floor, her expensive designer gown tangled around her knees, and let out a piercing, manic scream. "You ruined everything!" Chelsea shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. She shoved her way through the fleeing crowd, marching aggressively toward the stage. Her heavy diamond necklace swung wildly against her chest. Her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess, and thick black streaks of expensive mascara ran heavily down her cheeks. "You jealous, psychotic failure. You did this because you could never be me. You could never be the favorite. You destroyed our family just because Dad loved me more." She looked absolutely deranged, screaming at the top of her lungs, while her wealthy friends stared at her in utter revulsion. The remaining guests whipped out their cameras, eagerly recording the spectacular meltdown of the previously flawless heiress. I stood at the podium and looked down at my frantic sister, feeling absolutely nothing but cold clinical pity. "I did not destroy this family." "Chelsea," I replied through the microphone, ensuring my voice carried over her manic screaming. "I simply turned on the lights so everyone could see the rot. Your husband and your father stole $15 million from innocent people to fund your designer lifestyle. The bank is officially closed and your performance is over." Chelsea let out another feral scream, attempting to climb the carpeted stairs to physically attack me. She did not even make it to the second step. Two hotel security guards, realizing the power dynamic in the room had completely shifted, immediately intercepted her. They grabbed her by the arms, restraining her as she thrashed and kicked violently, screaming obscenities that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Her curated persona was permanently dead, replaced by the reality of a spoiled, broke accomplice facing the terrifying prospect of a life without a safety net. The flashes from dozens of smartphone cameras illuminated her humiliating struggle permanently, immortalizing the spectacular collapse of the golden child. The elite social circles she had desperately courted now watched her with absolute disdain, whispering harsh judgments as the hotel security tightened their grip. Harrison remained slumped in his chair on the stage, completely unable to help his favorite daughter. He stared blankly at the shredded contracts littering the ballroom floor, his breathing shallow and rapid. The impenetrable fortress of wealth and power he had used to terrorize me for 33 years was officially reduced to rubble. While hotel security dragged my screaming sister toward the lobby, I kept my eyes locked on the back of the ballroom. Dion had been paralyzed near the bar, clutching a rapidly warming glass of expensive scotch. The overwhelming magnitude of the federal evidence displayed on the 40-foot screens finally pierced his arrogant finance broker facade. He looked at the red highlighted offshore wire transfers, the exact digital footprints of his catastrophic crypto losses, and the undeniable proof of his illegal pension fund theft. His chest heaved as blind panic completely consumed him. He looked at the stage, making direct eye contact with me for a fraction of a second. I offered him a cold, knowing smile. Dayon did not look at his father-in-law slumping in a chair on the stage. He did not look at his wife violently thrashing against the security guards near the main entrance. When forced to choose between his family and his own survival, Dion made the exact selfish calculation I always knew he would. He dropped his expensive crystal glass onto the plush carpet, turned his back on his entire life and bolted. He sprinted away from the VIP tables, shoving a horrified waiter violently out of his path. His heavy leather shoes pounded against the marble flooring as he frantically scanned the perimeter for an exit strategy. He dodged a massive floral arrangement and aimed directly for the heavy swinging wooden doors that led into the hotel service corridors and the main catering kitchen. He thought he could slip out through the loading dock blend into the chaotic downtown Chicago traffic and use whatever hidden cryptocurrency he had left to disappear before the federal indictments officially landed. But he was severely underestimating the professionals I had brought with me. The two plainclothes FBI agents standing near the podium did not shout or draw their weapons in the crowded ballroom. They communicated with a single sharp nod. The taller agent immediately spoke into his wrist microphone, coordinating with a tactical team already positioned around the entire perimeter of the hotel. The second agent vaulted smoothly off the side of the stage and sprinted parallel to Dion's escape route, moving with terrifying speed and precision. Dion hit the swinging wooden doors with his full body weight, crashing violently into the bustling service kitchen. The sharp smell of searing meat and expensive truffle oil filled the air as he slipped on the greasy tile floor. He scrambled frantically to regain his footing, knocking over a tall metal rack of clean silver platters. The loud metallic clatter echoed through the chaotic kitchen as chefs and line cooks jumped out of the way in sheer terror. Dion scrambled towards the heavy metal exit doors leading to the loading dock, gasping for air, fully believing he had successfully evaded capture. The federal agents were waiting for him. As Dion reached for the exit handle, the heavy doors violently burst open from the outside. A team of federal agents flooded the kitchen. The agent who had chased him from the ballroom tackled Dion from behind with uncompromising force. Dion let out a breathless yelp as he was violently shoved forward. The agent slammed him face first directly against a massive stainless steel prep table. Pots and pans clattered loudly to the floor as Dion struggled uselessly against the overwhelming physical restraint. The agent pinned Dion's cheek against the cold, sterile metal surface, twisting both of his arms sharply behind his back. The distinct metallic click of heavy steel, handcuffs snapping securely around his wrists, echoed sharply over the stunned silence of the kitchen staff. "Dion, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud and embezzlement," the lead agent announced, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Dion stopped struggling. The arrogant, untouchable crypto broker who had mocked me and tried to steal my business just days ago completely deflated. He hung his head in absolute defeat, his custom-tailored suit stained with kitchen grease as the federal agents hauled him to his feet and marched him out the back door toward a waiting armored vehicle. Back inside the grand ballroom, the situation had completely deteriorated for the architect of this entire criminal enterprise. Harrison slowly pushed himself up from the chair on the stage. His face was a sickly ashen gray slick with cold sweat. The charismatic titan of Chicago real estate was entirely gone. He stumbled heavily down the carpeted stairs of the stage, grasping the brass railing tightly to keep his shaking legs from collapsing underneath him. The remaining high society guests backed away from him in sheer revulsion, parting like the Red Sea to avoid any association with a ruined felon. Harrison staggered onto the main floor, his breath coming in shallow, desperate wheezes. He looked around wildly for an ally, a friend, or an employee to shield him from the impending legal slaughter. His desperate eyes landed on Bradley. My cowardly ex-fiancé was standing near a marble pillar, furiously typing on his phone, likely trying to secure a new job before the news broke. Harrison stumbled toward him, reaching out a trembling hand. "Bradley, help me!" Harrison gasped, grabbing the sleeve of Bradley's rented tuxedo. "Call the legal team. Get the car ready. We have to spin this narrative before the markets open tomorrow. We can fix this." Bradley looked at this pathetic broken man clutching his jacket. He looked up at the massive digital screens displaying the unredacted proof of the $15 million embezzlement scheme. Bradley realized in that exact second that the bottomless bank account he had happily sold his soul for was entirely empty. There was no luxury condo down payment. There was no executive promotion. There was only a sinking ship heading straight for a federal prison. Bradley sneered, swatting Harrison's trembling hand away with violent disgust. "Do not touch me," Bradley spat, physically shoving the older man backward. "I have absolutely nothing to do with you or your criminal schemes. You are on your own, old man." Harrison stumbled backward from the forceful shove, his last remaining shred of hope completely evaporating. Before he could regain his balance, the heavy main doors of the ballroom swung wide open again. A squad of uniformed Chicago police officers marched purposefully onto the floor, having been called to assist the federal agents in securing the prime suspect. They surrounded Harrison instantly. The lead officer grabbed my father's arms firmly, pulling them behind his back. The harsh ratcheting sound of handcuffs locking into place punctuated the silence of the room. "Harrison, you are under arrest," the officer declared loudly, reading him his Miranda rights right there on the gala floor in front of his wealthy peers. I stood silently on the stage, looking down at the man who had tormented me my entire life. He was marched out of the ballroom in steel chains, stripped of his wealth, his power and his freedom, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of his own arrogant greed. 48 hours later, the spectacular collapse of my father's empire dominated every news channel and financial blog across the country. I sat in my floral shop, watching the morning broadcast on my tablet. The local news helicopters circled high above the sleek glass towers of Harrison Development headquarters. Down on the street level, federal agents carried heavy cardboard boxes filled with confiscated hard drives and physical ledgers out of the building. The grand revolving glass doors of my father's corporate lobby were now tightly wrapped in thick steel chains and officially padlocked by federal authorities. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the freezing wind, marking the permanent death of a fraudulent dynasty. The news anchors reported that Harrison had suffered a minor cardiac event during his booking process, delaying his initial court appearance, but the authorities were not showing him any leniency. He remained under heavy federal guard at a secured medical facility. Dion, however, was already experiencing the harsh reality of the criminal justice system. After his pathetic attempt to flee through the hotel kitchen, the federal judge deemed my arrogant brother-in-law an extreme flight risk. I was explicitly denied bail. The flashy crypto broker who had mocked my livelihood just days ago was currently sitting in a cold concrete holding cell, wearing a scratchy orange jumpsuit entirely cut off from his luxury cars and offshore wallets. I set my tablet down on the wooden counter and picked up a broom. I was sweeping up the last fragments of broken glass from the vandalism when the small brass bell above my front door chimed. I turned around expecting a private security guard. Instead, I saw a ghost of Chicago high society stumbling through my doorway. It was Chelsea. The flawless, untouchable golden child looked completely unrecognizable. The expensive tailored designer coat she wore was severely rumpled and stained with spilled coffee. Her pristine salon-styled hair was greasy and tangled in messy knots. Thick, dark streaks of dried mascara stained her pale cheeks, making her look incredibly haggard and desperate. Stripped of her unlimited credit cards and her curated social media validation, my younger sister looked exactly like the hollow, empty shell she truly was inside. Chelsea did not swagger into my shop demanding respect like she had before. She practically collapsed the second she crossed the threshold. Her knees hit the hard wooden floor with a heavy thud. She crawled forward, entirely abandoning her pride, and desperately grabbed the hem of my blazer with shaking hands. "Natalie, please," Chelsea sobbed loudly, staring up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. "You have to help me. They took everything. The bank froze all my personal checking accounts. A tow truck came in the middle of the night and repossessed my sports car. I cannot even buy groceries. You have to use the trust fund to bail Dion out. His lawyer says it will cost $2 million in cash to get him out of that cell. Please, Natalie, you have $40 million. You have to save us." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic woman clinging to my clothes. This was the same sister who had filmed me in my darkest hour to mock me for her internet followers. This was the woman who had laughed while her husband slapped an eviction notice on my counter. She did not care that Dion had stolen millions of dollars from innocent working-class families. She only cared that her luxury lifestyle was evaporating, and she fully expected me to open my grandfather's vault to fund her delusions. I firmly grabbed Chelsea's wrists and peeled her shaking hands off my blazer, stepping back so she was left kneeling alone on the floor. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no sympathy, only a cold, clinical closure. You mocked me, you tried to evict me, you destroyed my reputation online. I said, my voice echoing with unyielding finality in the quiet shop. The bank is closed, Chelsea. The effect of my words was instantaneous and terrifying. The desperate sobbing victim routine completely vanished in a split second. The fake tears stopped flowing. Chelsea's face contorted into a mask of pure venomous rage. Her eyes narrowed into hateful slits as she scrambled awkwardly to her feet, her designer coat slipping off her shoulder. "Fine," Chelsea screamed, her voice cracking with vicious hostility. "Let Dion rot in that concrete cell. I do not even care about him. He is a pathetic loser who ruined my entire life. He dragged me into this mess. He and Dad forced me to make those videos about you. They made me do it. I never wanted to evict you. They manipulated me because they knew I was vulnerable. You should be punishing them, not me. I am totally blameless here." I watched in absolute disgust as my sister threw her own husband and our father completely under the bus without a single second of hesitation. The moment she realized I would not give her a dime, she turned on the men she had happily enabled just days ago. She was willing to say anything, betray anyone, and burn every bridge to save her own skin. "You are exactly like them," I replied, my voice slicing through her frantic screaming. "You enabled their crimes because you loved spending the stolen money. You enjoyed watching them hurt me. You are not a victim, Chelsea. You are an accomplice, and you are going to face the exact same reality they do." Chelsea let out a feral shriek of frustration, realizing her manipulation had completely failed. She turned and stormed out of my shop, violently slamming the glass door behind her. I watched her stomp down the freezing Chicago street entirely alone, completely broke and walking straight toward a life she absolutely deserved. I took a deep, satisfying breath. The golden child had finally fallen from her high pedestal. The quiet silence she left behind was absolutely beautiful. I locked the front door of my shop, flipped the sign to closed, and walked back to my counter to finally drink my cold coffee. Before I could even take a sip, my cell phone buzzed against the wooden surface. The screen lit up with a notification, and I felt a sharp, cynical laugh bubble up in my chest when I saw the caller ID. It was Bradley. My cowardly ex-fiancé had clearly spent the last 48 hours watching the exact same news broadcasts as the rest of the city. He had watched my father get hauled away in handcuffs. He had watched Dion get denied bail. But most importantly, he had watched the financial reporters confirm that I was now the sole uncontested controller of the $40 million Silas Bearer Trust. Bradley had done the math. He realized that the massive wealth he had happily sold his soul to inherit was no longer locked inside my father's fraudulent real estate empire. It was sitting directly in my bank account. I did not answer the phone. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, a long text message popped onto my screen. "Nat, I was so wrong. Your dad completely brainwashed me. He told me he would ruin my career if I did not side with him at the wedding. I was just trying to protect our future. I never stopped loving you. Please let me make it up to you. Can we talk? I miss you so much." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the pathetic, groveling words. 2 days ago, this man had looked me directly in the eye, told me to stop being dramatic, and ordered me to apologize to the man who abused me just so he could secure a down payment for a luxury condo. Now that I held the keys to a $40 million vault, he was suddenly the heartbroken victim of my father's manipulation, desperately trying to crawl his way back into my life. I did not type a single letter in response. I did not block his number yet. I wanted his absolute destruction to be meticulously documented and delivered with surgical precision. I picked up my phone and dialed Preston instead. My elite trust lawyer answered immediately. I told him exactly what I needed. I wanted a comprehensive, legally binding invoice drafted for the ruined wedding. I wanted every single expense my father had bragged about paying tallied up to the absolute final cent. The luxury hotel ballroom, the imported caviar, the custom floral arrangements, the vintage champagne. The total came to exactly $100,000. But I was not stopping at a simple invoice. I instructed Preston to attach a formal legal summons. We were suing Bradley in civil court for severe emotional distress, financial damages, and breach of contract. Within 2 hours, a heavy, pristine white envelope was sitting on my counter, hand-delivered by one of Preston's legal aides. I opened it, verified the dense legal documents, and pulled a bright yellow sticky note from my desk drawer. I grabbed a thick black marker and wrote 5 simple, devastating words. I slapped the sticky note directly onto the center of the massive invoice, sealed the envelope, and handed it to a specialized private courier. Across the city, inside the sterile open-plan layout of a mid-level corporate logistics firm, Bradley was sweating profusely. He sat at his cubicle, aggressively bouncing his knee, constantly refreshing his phone screen, waiting for my reply. His coworkers were already casting sideways glances at him. The explosive news of the Harrison development scandal was trending everywhere, and everyone in his office knew Bradley had been engaged to the disgraced tycoon's daughter. They had all heard him bragging for months about his impending entry into Chicago high society. Now they were watching him squirm in his cheap office chair as the empire he boasted about crumbled on live television. The heavy glass doors of the corporate office swung open. A uniformed private courier carrying a thick, sealed white envelope marched straight past the reception desk. The courier's booming, authoritative voice echoed across the quiet floor as he called out Bradley's full legal name. Dozens of heads popped up from over their cubicle walls. The rhythmic typing of keyboards completely stopped. Every single employee in the entire department turned to watch as the courier marched directly up to Bradley's desk. Bradley stood up, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson, as the courier aggressively shoved the heavy envelope into his trembling hands, demanding a signature confirming receipt of formal legal documents. Bradley signed the clipboard, his hands shaking violently. He tried to offer his coworkers a weak, dismissive smile, pretending it was just routine paperwork. But the heavy, embossed seal of Preston's elite downtown law firm on the envelope gave it away. It was a high-powered legal strike. Unable to control his desperate curiosity, Bradley tore open the top of the envelope right there in the middle of the silent office floor. He pulled out the thick stack of papers. The very first page was the itemized invoice. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he read the bold, undeniable total at the bottom of the page, $100,000. He flipped to the second page, his breath catching in his throat as he read the formal civil court summons, demanding he appear before a judge to answer for financial damages and emotional distress. He had expected a text message. He had expected an angry phone call where he could use his manipulative charm to gaslight me into taking him back. Instead, he was holding a financial death sentence that would utterly bankrupt him and drag his name through a public court battle. Then Bradley saw the bright yellow sticky note slapped right in the middle of the legal summons. He stared at my handwriting, the same handwriting that had drafted our wedding invitations. The message was crystal clear, echoing the exact cruel words my father had used when he destroyed my grandfather's gift. Trash belongs with trash. Bradley collapsed back into his cheap office chair, the heavy legal documents slipping from his sweaty fingers and scattering across his desk for all of his nosy coworkers to see. The illusion of his successful, upwardly mobile life was permanently shattered. He had gambled his entire future on my father's toxic wealth, and his grand prize was a massive lawsuit that would financially ruin him for the rest of his life. I sat in my shop looking out at the freezing Chicago streets and smiled. The gold digger had finally received his payout. The wheels of federal justice usually turn at an agonizingly slow pace, but my father and brother-in-law had left behind a digital blood trail so massive and undeniable that the prosecution moved with terrifying speed. Within a matter of months, the crisp winter air of Chicago gave way to a sweltering summer, and the highly anticipated federal trial officially began. I walked into the imposing federal courthouse flanked by Preston and my lead forensic accountant. I did not sit behind the defense table to offer familial support. I sat directly in the front row of the gallery, positioned perfectly so that Harrison and Dion had to look at me every single time they turned around to face the crowded room. The trial itself was an absolute bloodbath. The prosecution did not even need to rely on dramatic witness testimonies or emotional appeals to sway the jury. They simply projected the exact same forensic ledgers we had uncovered in Preston's war room onto the glowing courtroom monitors. The jury watched in stunned silence as the prosecution meticulously tracked every single stolen dollar from the hardworking employees' pension funds directly into Dion's catastrophic offshore cryptocurrency wallets. The paper trail was completely bulletproof. My father's expensive defense attorneys looked physically exhausted, repeatedly rubbing their temples as they tried and failed to poke holes in the airtight financial timeline. When it became blatantly obvious that a guilty verdict was entirely unavoidable, the fragile alliance between the two arrogant men violently shattered. Dion took the stand in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save his own skin. Wearing an ill-fitting suit provided by his public defender, because his personal bank accounts were entirely frozen, my brother-in-law completely abandoned his loyalty to the family. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Harrison across the courtroom. Dion testified that he was nothing more than a naive subordinate, manipulated and strong-armed by his powerful, overbearing father-in-law. He claimed Harrison orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme and forced him to execute the illegal wire transfers under the threat of terminating his employment and ruining his marriage to Chelsea. It was a spectacular display of cowardice, but it did not save him. The federal prosecutor immediately produced digital communication logs proving Dion had actively initiated the high-risk trades and personally requested the illegal cover funds to hide his sheer incompetence. The judge stared down at Dion with absolute disgust, recognizing him not as a victim of manipulation, but as a greedy, arrogant fraud who gambled away the retirement savings of innocent people to fund his luxury cars and flashy designer watches. When the gavel finally fell, the sentence was severe and unyielding. Dion was convicted of multiple counts of federal wire fraud and embezzlement. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. I watched the remaining color drain from Dion's face as the bailiffs approached him, placed his hands behind his back, and secured the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The swaggering finance bro who had tried to evict me from my own shop was marched out of the courtroom, destined for a concrete cell where his expensive suits and arrogant attitude meant absolutely nothing. Then it was my father's turn to face the music. Harrison sat at the defense table looking incredibly small and frail. The severe stress of the trial and the complete public collapse of his empire had physically ravaged him. He slouched in his wooden chair, relying heavily on a cane, his breathing labored and shallow. But the federal judge showed no sympathy for the architect of such a massive, callous betrayal. The court systematically dismantled Harrison development piece by piece. My father was permanently stripped of all his commercial and residential real estate licenses. I was officially banned from ever holding an executive position or managing corporate funds for the rest of his natural life. The financial penalties were even more devastating. The judge slapped Harrison with millions of dollars in severe federal fines and mandated full immediate restitution to the employee pension funds. Because the Silas Bearer Trust had already secured the primary liens on all of his properties, Harrison had absolutely no assets left to liquidate. He was forced to stand up in front of the packed courtroom, look the judge in the eye, and officially declare total, inescapable legal bankruptcy. The great real estate titan of Chicago was completely wiped out, reduced to a negative net worth and permanently stripped of the prestigious family name he had valued above everything else. However, the ultimate reality check came during his sentencing. Due to his advanced age, his verified history of severe cardiac issues, and the rapidly declining state of his overall health, following the stress of his arrest, Harrison's legal team managed to successfully argue for a compassionate sentencing reduction. He narrowly avoided a lengthy federal prison term that would have undoubtedly served as a physical death sentence. Instead, he was sentenced to 5 years of strict house arrest and heavily monitored probation. But avoiding a concrete prison cell did not mean he escaped his punishment. When the court finally, Harrison shuffled slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. I stood up from my seat in the front row and watched him walk toward the heavy oak doors. There was no fleet of luxury black cars waiting for him outside. There were no sycophantic investors eager to shake his hand. There were no loyal friends, no business partners, and no golden child daughter waiting to offer him comfort. Chelsea had not even bothered to show up to the trial, completely abandoning him the exact second his bank accounts hit zero. My father was a free man in name only. He stepped out of the courthouse completely broke, entirely stripped of his power, and utterly alone in the world. He had spent his entire life valuing wealth over his own blood, and now he had absolutely neither. I turned my back on his retreating figure and walked out of the courtroom with Preston by my side, ready to officially clean up the wreckage he left behind. The federal mandate to repay the embezzled pension funds was the first step in cleaning up the wreckage my father left behind. It required the immediate and aggressive liquidation of every single asset bearing his name. His fleet of luxury vehicles was swiftly impounded and auctioned off by the state. His private country club memberships were revoked in a highly public, humiliating fashion. But the most significant and symbolic casualty of his catastrophic financial collapse was the sprawling, multi-million-dollar suburban mansion where I had spent my entire childhood feeling like an unwanted ghost. The massive estate, with its custom marble fountains, imported Italian columns, and meticulously manicured gardens, immediately fell into severe foreclosure. The heavy iron security gates that once kept the world away from the Golden family were now plastered with bright neon legal notices from the federal bankruptcy courts. Inside those imposing walls, the atmosphere was completely suffocating. Without the army of professional housekeepers, expensive landscapers, and private chefs, the massive estate quickly began to feel like a decaying, empty mausoleum. Harrison and Chelsea were trapped inside, forced to live among the hollow ghosts of their vanished wealth. The electricity had been severely restricted to basic necessities, and the central heating was completely shut off to conserve whatever meager funds the bankruptcy lawyers allowed them to access for basic daily survival. They spent their days wandering the echoing, freezing hallways, bitterly packing their remaining personal belongings into cheap cardboard boxes, fully assuming the federal bank would soon arrive to lock the doors and seize the property for public auction. Chelsea, who had returned to the mansion after being completely shunned and blocked by all of her wealthy friends, spent her hours crying over her confiscated designer handbags and screaming at Harrison for ruining her perfect, effortless life. It was a bleak, overcast Tuesday morning when the final reality of their situation arrived at their doorstep. Harrison sat heavily on a stripped mattress in the grand foyer, his wooden cane resting against his trembling knee. He wore a faded, wrinkled sweater, looking completely unrecognizable from the sharp-tailored real estate tycoon he used to be. Chelsea knelt on the dusty hardwood floor nearby, frantically wrapping a few remaining pieces of cheap costume jewelry in old newspaper, her hands shaking with angry frustration. They were bracing themselves for the anonymous bank representatives to arrive and formally escort them off the premises. Instead, the heavy oak front doors swung wide open without a single knock. The heavy hinges groaned loudly, echoing through the empty, cavernous foyer like a gunshot. Harrison and Chelsea both snapped their heads up, expecting to see uniformed sheriff deputies or aggressive bank liquidators holding clipboards. They did not see the police. Preston stepped smoothly over the threshold, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the imported hardwood floor. He wore a pristine navy blue suit, carrying his signature leather legal portfolio tightly under his arm. He did not say a word, simply stepping aside to hold the heavy wooden door open. I walked into the foyer right behind him. I wore a tailored crimson trench coat and carried a single crisp manila folder in my hand. The absolute shock that washed over my father and my sister was instantaneous and palpable. Chelsea gasped loudly, dropping a tangled necklace directly onto the floor. Harrison gripped the head of his wooden cane, his knuckles turning stark white as he stared at me in complete disbelief. They had fully expected to be humiliated by faceless bank officials, not confronted by the daughter they had spent 33 years systematically destroying. "What are you doing in my house?" Harrison croaked, his voice, thin, raspy, and completely devoid of its former booming authority. "You have no right to be here. Get out before I call the police for trespassing." I did not laugh at his pathetic, empty threat. I simply stopped in the absolute center of the grand foyer, looking around at the bare walls where expensive, pretentious portraits used to hang. I opened the manila folder and pulled out a heavy notarized document bearing the official seal of the county clerk. I held it up so the natural light from the open doorway illuminated the bold black ink. "You do not own a house," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the high vaulted ceilings. And you certainly do not have the authority to call the police on the legal owner of this estate." Chelsea scrambled awkwardly to her feet, her eyes darting between me and the heavy legal document in my hand. "What is she talking about?" Chelsea demanded, turning frantically toward our father. "The bank foreclosed on the property. The bank took it. The bank certainly put it up for absolute liquidation," Preston corrected smoothly, stepping forward to deliver the legal death blow. "But the bank no longer holds the deed. The property was purchased in a private expedited cash transaction 48 hours ago. The funds were wired directly from the Silas Bearer Trust." Preston pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward me. "My client, Miss Natalie, is the sole uncontested owner of this entire estate." The remaining color drained completely from Harrison's wrinkled face. He stared at the deed in my hand, his mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocating horror. The sprawling mansion, his ultimate symbol of power and status, had been bought out from under him using the exact same trust fund he had desperately tried to steal. Chelsea let out a sharp, hysterical sob, covering her face with her hands, as the crushing reality of her absolute homelessness finally set in. I looked down at my father, feeling no pity, no remorse, and no hesitation. "You have exactly 1 hour to vacate my property," I commanded, locking eyes with the broken man sitting on the mattress. "If you and your daughter are still standing inside these walls when 60 minutes expire, I will have my private security team physically throw you out onto the street. Your time starts right now." I turned my back on them and walked out the front door, leaving Preston behind to aggressively monitor their frantic departure. Exactly 59 minutes later, Harrison stumbled out of the grand entrance. The great real estate titan lowered his head in ultimate agonizing defeat, carrying a single taped-up cardboard box of meager belongings, and shuffled slowly down the driveway toward absolute nothingness. Chelsea followed closely behind him, dragging a heavy black trash bag filled with the only items the federal bankruptcy lawyers allowed her to keep. Her expensive fur coat was gone, seized by authorities to help pay back the massive pension fund deficit. She wore a faded tracksuit, her posture entirely broken. The heavy iron gates of the estate clicked shut behind them with a loud, absolute finality. They were entirely cut off from the world of luxury they had ruthlessly hoarded for decades. With Dion locked away in a federal penitentiary and all their corporate bank accounts permanently frozen, the father and daughter had absolutely nowhere to go but the very bottom. The court-appointed bankruptcy trustee had secured them a temporary subsidized living arrangement on the extreme outskirts of the city. It was a cramped, run-down studio apartment situated directly above a noisy 24-hour laundromat. The walls were paper-thin, covered in peeling yellow paint, and the ancient radiator in the corner clanked violently throughout the freezing Chicago nights. Chelsea sat on the sagging, stained mattress that took up half the floor space of their dismal new home. She pulled out her smartphone, the last piece of technology she possessed that was not repossessed by federal agents. She desperately opened her social media applications, hoping to leverage her misery into viral sympathy. She planned to post a tearful video begging her millions of followers for digital donations, eager to spin a new web of lies about being a victim of an unfair legal system. Instead, she found an absolute digital wasteland. Her follower count was rapidly plummeting in real time. The elite socialites and wealthy influencers she had relentlessly courted had completely blocked her accounts, refusing to be associated with the wife of a convicted federal embezzler. The comment sections on her previous posts were a war zone of intense public mockery. Former fans viciously ridiculed her spectacular downfall, posting high-resolution screenshots of her manic meltdown at the charity gala. The pristine, highly curated digital empire she valued more than human connection had completely evaporated. She locked her phone screen and threw it against the peeling wall, letting out a sharp, frustrated scream that went entirely ignored by the noisy street traffic outside. The reality of severe poverty does not wait for a bruised ego to heal. With no trust fund, no husband to steal for her, and Harrison completely stripped of his ability to generate any income, Chelsea had to face the ultimate indignity. She had to secure a manual labor job simply to afford cheap groceries and keep the bare bulbs illuminating their squalid apartment. 2 weeks later, the former golden child of Chicago real estate stood behind the checkout counter of a discount grocery store. The humiliating transformation was complete. She wore an oversized, scratchy green polyester vest with a plastic name tag pinned crookedly to her chest. Her hands, once adorned with heavy insured diamonds and perfect manicures, were now dry and cracked from handling dirty cash and breaking down cardboard boxes in the freezing stockroom. Chelsea scanned a barcode, the harsh beep of the register grating against her exhausted nerves. A large, impatient woman stood on the other side of the conveyor belt, tapping her foot aggressively. "Are you going to bag those cans or just stare at them?" the customer barked, glaring at Chelsea with deep irritation. "I do not have all day." Chelsea gripped a heavy can of soup, her jaw tight with suppressed rage. "I am moving as fast as I can," Chelsea snapped back, a fleeting glimpse of her old entitled arrogance slipping out. The customer slammed her purse down onto the metal counter. "Do not give me that attitude," the woman shouted, her voice echoing down the entire grocery aisle, drawing the stares of other shoppers. "I asked for double bagging, and you are just tossing my items around like garbage. I want to speak to your manager right now. You are completely incompetent." A year ago, Chelsea would have thrown a glass of champagne in the woman's face and demanded her immediate removal by private security. Today, Chelsea completely froze. The store manager, a stern teenager making minimum wage, rushed over and immediately took the customer's side. He sternly ordered Chelsea to apologize to the woman and clean up the spilled items, explicitly threatening to dock her pay for insubordination. Chelsea swallowed her immense pride. Her throat burned with the bitter taste of utter humiliation. She looked down at the dirty linoleum floor, her face burning hot with intense shame, and muttered a pathetic, groveling apology to the irate customer. She bagged the groceries with shaking hands, acutely aware that she was easily replaceable and entirely dependent on this miserable paycheck just to survive another week. When her grueling 8-hour shift finally ended, Chelsea took 2 separate buses to return to the cramped, noisy studio apartment. She unlocked the flimsy wooden door and walked inside, dropping her plastic grocery bags onto the small, scratched kitchen counter. The apartment smelled of cheap microwave dinners and profound despair. Harrison sat in a faded second-hand armchair in the center of the tiny room. The man who used to command boardrooms and terrorize city officials was completely broken. He wore the exact same wrinkled sweater he had worn the day of his eviction. His wooden cane rested on the floor next to him. He stared blankly ahead, his eyes fixed dead onto a small, dusty television screen sitting on a plastic milk crate. The television was completely turned off. Harrison was not watching a program. He was staring into the dark, reflective glass of the blank screen, completely lost in the hollow void of his own making. He had no power, no influence, and no fear left to instill in anyone. He was trapped in a self-made prison of poverty, reliant entirely on the meager earnings of the daughter he had raised to be completely useless. Chelsea looked at her father, feeling absolutely no sympathy, only a heavy, suffocating resentment. She walked over to the ancient radiator, wrapped her arms tightly around herself in her scratchy green vest, and stared out the dirty window at the freezing city streets below. The golden child had finally inherited the exact life she deserved. Across the city, far away from the squalid apartment where my father and sister were currently suffocating in their own misery, I stood completely alone in the center of the sprawling suburban estate I now legally owned. The heavy iron security gates remained firmly locked behind me, blocking out the intrusive glare of the public and the relentless flashing cameras of the local press. I looked up at the towering multi-million-dollar mansion. The imposing stone columns and dark, heavily tinted windows loomed over the meticulously manicured lawn like a fortress designed exclusively for intimidation. For 33 years, this house had been a gilded prison. It was the exact place where my father had systematically crushed my self-esteem, where he had treated me like a worthless outsider while showering his golden child with unearned luxury. Preston stood a respectful distance away on the sweeping paved driveway, holding a thick folder of structural blueprints and property surveys. He patiently waited for my final decision on what to do with the massive property. The real estate market was highly eager to acquire the infamous Harrison estate, and liquidating the mansion would have easily added millions of dollars directly into the Silas Bearer Trust. But as I stared at the towering front doors where I had been turned away so many times, a completely different vision materialized in my mind. I absolutely refused to sleep a single night inside those toxic walls. I would not allow my grandfather's hard-earned wealth to preserve a monument to my father's cruel ego. I turned around and looked directly at Preston. "We are not selling it," I declared, my voice cutting sharply through the quiet suburban air. "And I am certainly not living in it. I want you to hire the best commercial contracting crew in Chicago. Bring me the sledgehammers, Preston. We are tearing the dark heart right out of this place." Within 72 hours, the quiet, affluent neighborhood was completely taken over by the deafening roar of heavy construction machinery. A massive fleet of industrial dump trucks and commercial excavators rolled straight through the open iron gates. I did not just sit in an air-conditioned office and sign the work orders. I put on a bright yellow hard hat strapped on heavy leather construction gloves and walked directly into the grand foyer alongside the demolition crew. I gripped a heavy steel sledgehammer with both hands, squared my shoulders, and swung it with every ounce of physical strength I possessed. The heavy steel head crashed violently into the imported marble fireplace where my father used to stand and lecture me about my utter worthlessness. The expensive stone shattered instantly into 1,000 jagged pieces, raining down onto the hardwood floor in a cloud of thick white dust. The sheer physical release of destroying that toxic monument was absolutely euphoric. The demolition crews worked relentlessly for weeks. We methodically knocked down the oppressive dark mahogany-paneled walls of my father's former executive home office. We ripped out the pretentious imported Italian crystal chandeliers that hung in the grand dining room. We aggressively gutted the massive structure straight down to its bare wooden studs, completely stripping away decades of suffocating arrogance and manufactured superiority. The dark, imposing fortress that had actively terrorized me was entirely erased from existence. Once the heavy dust finally settled over the property, the radical transformation began in earnest. Using the vast, untouched financial resources of the Bearer Trust, I hired a brilliant team of forward-thinking architects and specialized interior designers. Their strict mandate was to completely reverse the oppressive energy of the original structure. We knocked out the heavy brick walls and installed massive floor-to-ceiling structural glass windows, allowing brilliant natural sunlight to finally flood into the previously shadowy, cold interior spaces. The suffocating darkness was permanently banished. I oversaw every single detail of the aggressive remodel. The sprawling grand ballroom, the exact room where my father used to host his lavish, deceitful corporate parties to impress his corrupt investors, was entirely subdivided. We built a network of warm, welcoming, and highly secure therapy offices. The massive luxury guest suites on the upper floor, spaces previously reserved only for wealthy foreign venture capitalists and arrogant business partners, were completely transformed. We turned them into comfortable, fully furnished, safe housing rooms. These secure suites were specifically designed to provide temporary, high-quality shelter for vulnerable individuals, desperately trying to escape the exact same financial abuse, domestic manipulation, and familial toxicity I had just survived. The exterior of the estate underwent an equally miraculous metamorphosis. Drawing heavily on my professional expertise as a boutique floral designer, I completely tore up my father's rigid, pretentious landscaping. I ordered the construction crews to aggressively uproot the expensive imported hedge mazes and the imposing stone gargoyles that littered the property. In their place, I personally designed and planted expansive, sprawling wellness gardens. We built state-of-the-art therapeutic greenhouses, constructed entirely of curved glass and warm cedar wood. We laid down winding, peaceful walking paths, paved with smooth river stones, weaving them through acres of brightly colored blooming wildflowers and tall swaying willow trees. The air around the estate no longer smelled of expensive cigars and bitter corporate greed. It smelled of fresh jasmine, damp earth, and blooming lavender. I walked through the newly constructed botanical gardens, watching the sunlight bounce off the sparkling glass of the new greenhouses. The oppressive, terrifying mansion of my youth was completely gone. In its place stood a vibrant open sanctuary of light healing and absolute safety. I had taken the physical manifestation of my father's ultimate cruelty and successfully weaponized it into a fortress of profound healing. The estate no longer existed to intimidate the vulnerable. It existed entirely to empower them, entirely funded by the very trust my father had violently tried to steal. I smiled, feeling the warm Chicago sun on my face, knowing the final crowning piece of my grandfather's legacy was finally ready to open its doors to the world. 6 months after the demolition crews tore down my father's oppressive fortress, the crisp autumn breeze swept across the sprawling, vibrant lawns of the newly finished estate. The towering, intimidating iron gates that once locked the world away were permanently propped wide open. A massive crowd had gathered on the sweeping paved driveway, but it was not the corrupt, sycophantic elite of my father's era. Today, the estate welcomed prominent mental health advocates, dedicated social workers, top-tier investigative journalists, and local community leaders. They stood buzzing with genuine excitement, surrounded by the blooming lavender gardens and the sparkling glass therapy greenhouses. I stood proudly at the top of the wide stone steps, flanked by the people who had actually helped me build this new reality. Preston stood to my right, looking impeccably sharp in his signature navy suit, holding a leather binder containing the final verified endowment papers. The lead forensic accountant stood to my left, her arms crossed, offering a rare, triumphant smile. I stepped up to the polished wooden podium set up directly in front of the massive sunlit glass entrance doors. I reached out and firmly grasped a pair of oversized, gleaming silver scissors. The low hum of the excited crowd fell into a deeply respectful silence. "Welcome, everyone," I announced, my voice projecting with clear, unwavering authority over the microphone. For over 3 decades, this exact property stood as a monument to greed, intimidation, and absolute control. It was built on lies and funded by the theft of hardworking people. But today we reclaim this ground. Today we open the doors to the Silas Psychological Recovery Institute. The crowd erupted into spontaneous, thunderous applause. I raised my hand to let the noise settle before continuing my speech. This institute is a fully funded nonprofit sanctuary designed exclusively for victims of financial abuse and familial manipulation, I declared, looking out at the sea of supportive faces. We provide emergency housing, elite legal counsel, and comprehensive psychological therapy entirely free of charge. We exist to ensure that no one ever has to choose between their personal safety and their financial survival. We exist to break the chains of toxic families and empower survivors to build their own independent empires. With one smooth, forceful motion, I brought the heavy silver scissors down and sliced cleanly through the thick emerald green ribbon stretched across the entrance. The fabric fluttered to the stone steps. Flashbulbs erupted in a blinding staccato rhythm, illuminating the bright, beautiful morning. The dark, suffocating history of the Harrison real estate dynasty was officially permanently dead and buried. As the eager journalists and excited dignitaries filtered through the grand glass doors to tour the state-of-the-art recovery facilities, I quietly stepped away from the flashing cameras and the overwhelming noise of the celebration. I walked alone down the bright, sunlit central corridor, my heels clicking softly against the newly installed warm cedar floors. I approached the heavy oak door at the very end of the hall, bearing a simple brushed brass plaque with my name engraved on it. I pushed the door open and stepped inside my new executive office. The space was absolutely breathtaking, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the peaceful river stone walking paths and the swaying willow trees outside. The room was entirely devoid of the dark, oppressive mahogany and the arrogant leather furniture my father had always favored. Waiting for me inside was the only family member who truly mattered. Grandpa Silas sat comfortably in a specialized, high-tech motorized wheelchair, positioned right beside my expansive, minimalist desk. Thanks to the limitless elite medical care provided by the Bearer Trust, he had made a remarkable, miraculous recovery from the severe stroke my father had aggressively triggered in the hospital. He could not walk long distances yet, but his mind was razor sharp, and his physical strength returned more every single day. He held a delicate porcelain cup of warm chamomile tea in his hands, his grip perfectly steady. When he looked up and saw me enter the room, a proud, brilliant smile completely transformed his weathered face, crinkling the corners of his kind eyes. "You did it," Natalie Grandpa Silas said, his voice carrying a raspy but undeniable strength infused with absolute unyielding pride. "You took the bitter poison right out of this soil and you grew a beautiful garden." I walked around the sleek desk and gently placed my hand directly over his, squeezing his fingers with deep, profound gratitude. "We did it, Grandpa," I replied softly, feeling a wave of absolute peace wash over my entire body. "They can never hurt anyone from this family ever again." I stepped behind my executive desk and turned around to face the main focal wall of the office. The space was not adorned with pretentious, wildly expensive classical art or arrogant oil portraits of old men in dark suits. Mounted directly in the absolute center of the pristine white wall was a stunning custom-made gold-plated shadow box. Thick museum-grade glass protected the single artifact resting carefully inside. Encased within the heavy gilded frame sat the old faded navy blue bank passbook. The cardboard cover remained severely warped and permanently discolored from the freezing ice water my father had violently thrown it into on the night of my ruined wedding. The edges of the small booklet were frayed, and the handwritten ink remained slightly blurred. It was the exact same piece of cardboard Harrison had snatched out of my hands and loudly declared as garbage in front of hundreds of wealthy investors. I stared intensely at the crumpled, water-stained passbook, running my fingers lightly over the cool, polished glass of the shadow box. My father had firmly believed that wealth was a brutal weapon used to crush the weak, to manipulate his daughters, and to demand absolute, unwavering obedience. He threw away the very key to his own salvation simply because it did not look expensive enough for his arrogant, superficial tastes. He traded a multi-generational fortune for a silver champagne bucket. The ultimate undeniable justice had been perfectly served. Dayon was locked inside a concrete federal prison cell, completely stripped of his custom suits and his flashy stolen crypto accounts. Chelsea was spending her days wearing a cheap polyester uniform, scrubbing sticky floors and bagging groceries for minimum wage, completely abandoned by her high society friends. Bradley was entirely bankrupted by the lawsuit I handed him, drowning in a mountain of debt he could never possibly repay. And Harrison, the ruthless real estate titan who tried to play God, was permanently trapped in a squalid, freezing studio apartment, staring blankly at a dead television screen with absolutely nothing left to his name. I looked back at Grandpa Silas. He raised his porcelain teacup in a silent, deeply satisfying toast to our victory. I turned my gaze back to the framed passbook, just as the bright golden sunlight from the massive windows caught the edge of the gilded frame, making it shine brilliantly in the quiet office. It stood as a permanent, glorious monument to my ultimate triumph. The absolute trash of an arrogant man had successfully become the unbreakable foundation of a healing empire. The story of Natalie and the discarded passbook offers a profound reflection on the true nature of value and the dangerous illusions of toxic power. Throughout the narrative, we witness a family entirely blinded by the superficial markers of success. Harrison, a man who measured human worth exclusively by designer labels, luxury real estate, and public perception, made the fatal mistake of confusing a worn piece of cardboard with actual garbage. He threw away his only salvation because it lacked a gilded edge. This arrogant dismissal perfectly encapsulates the central lesson of the story. True value rarely announces itself with a loud, flashy presentation, and true power does not require the degradation of others.